Our story begins with a man who just gained the powers of a creator, only to be diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer the very next day. To save his own life, he transformed his old family orchard into a sandbox world, hoping to accelerate the very process of evolution. His only goal was to foster a civilization capable of curing cancer, while the tiny inhabitants of this square sandbox began their exploration. One day, they were shocked to discover that their world was flat and that it was home to a giant of unimaginable proportions. Whenever a civilization failed to meet his expectations, he simply tore it all down to start over again. He would grant the heroes of each era a single chance to ask him a question, and they often asked how long it took to create their world. Recalling the time he spent digging the soil to build the sandbox, he realized it had taken him exactly 7 days. And so, the legend that God created all things in just 7 days began to spread across this tiny land. Civilizations rose and fell one after another in his sandbox. But who could have guessed that these brilliant cultures had such a humble beginning? It all started with a simple spore. He had built an artificial shallow pond within the orchard's primary sandbox. After adjusting the salinity to mimic an ocean, he introduced a vast number of zerg spores into the central waters. He accelerated the rate of cell division by 10,000 times, meaning every real day that passed equaled 10,000 years in the sandbox. Yet, even at that speed, it wasn't until the 5th day that these single-celled organisms finally began to evolve into plankton. As the central ocean grew visibly murky, he quickly imposed genetic limits to keep the size of these spore-based creatures in check. He couldn't allow them to grow too large, and by the afternoon of the 6th day, the primitive ecosystem finally began to shift. Multicellular life finally appeared in the water, and for a few minutes, it looked like a nature documentary playing at high speed. Species were born and went extinct in seconds, giving way to the next generation. But as the sun set, things took a predictable turn. The sandbox world faced its very first mass extinction, as 12 hours of darkness in his world meant something far more severe. It meant the world would be without sunlight for 5,000 years, causing vast amounts of aquatic plants to wither and sink. Under the cover of night, life seemed to vanish, as the small environment and limited biological base of his sandbox struggled to survive. The environment wasn't stable enough to produce new species, but we must remember these waters were filled with highly adaptable zerg single cells. After the moonlight had fallen for half an hour, a faint blue glow emerged on the surface of the sea, amidst the floating remains of dead plants. It was a blue plant, no larger than an ant and shaped like a leaf. Surprisingly, having lost the direct sunlight, this resilient little organism actually turned its photosynthesis toward the moon. He watched in awe, eventually naming this unexpected pioneer the blue flytrap. Once this plant successfully survived the first round of mass extinction, it began to evolve rapidly within a matter of seconds. The blue flytrap adapted frantically to the darkness, spreading across the water like lotus leaves to absorb the moonlight shining over the orchard. An hour later, after tens of thousands of generations of evolution, the species began to branch out into various new forms. It even developed into 2 distinct species. One group of blue flytraps continued to absorb moonlight, focusing entirely on conversion efficiency. The other group, however, turned carnivorous, using the absorbed moonlight to emit a faint fluorescence that acted as a lure. It attracted other planktonic blue flytraps, only to devour them. Observing this, he couldn't help but marvel at the sheer tenacity of life. This lone surviving aquatic plant had managed to develop its own diverse ecosystem within the pitch-black ocean. On a sudden whim, he decided to record these events, quickly finding a black notebook to serve as his chronicle. Opening to the first page of his Genesis, he wrote of the Dark Era, where the world changed and the sun gave way to the moon. The world had plunged into 5,000 years of darkness, leading to the mass extinction of 99% of all marine life. Only the blue flytrap survived, becoming the undisputed overlord of the dark ocean during this particular epoch. He looked at the pond, now a sea of life, silently wondering what kind of marine animals his zerg cells would produce next. He stayed awake all night waiting for dawn, but as the 7th day finally began, the situation took a tragic turn. The various blue flytraps that thrived in the dark withered instantly. Accustomed to weak moonlight, they sank as if they were being burned. In an instant, the blue flytraps faced a massive extinction of their own. By the afternoon, however, another speck of blue appeared. Life gradually returned from the dead colonies in the form of a 5-pointed star-shaped blue flytrap. It had found its own mutation. Having successfully escaped this mass extinction, it began reproducing through generations to adapt to the intense daylight environment. In just a few short minutes, this blue flytrap died and was reborn countless times over. Between the transition of day and night, the once dominant blue flytrap overlords faced a widespread, devastating extinction. From this, a weaker lineage known as the purple glow grass rose to prominence, becoming the protagonist of this new era. As the 7th night fell, the purple glow grass lived peacefully in the ocean, now capable of enduring the cycle of sun and moon. At the same time, the photosynthesis from these massive amounts of aquatic plants caused the ocean's oxygen levels to soar. The conditions for marine animals were finally met, and soon, the single-celled organisms in the sea began their purification and evolution. A group of creatures appeared first, and with them, marine animals officially stepped onto the historical stage of the evolutionary era. Seeing the animals appear, he finally allowed himself a relieved smile, his body exhausted after staying awake for a day and a night. He collapsed into bed, and by the 8th day of his sandbox creation, he noticed some marine animals were no longer satisfied. Driven by the fierce competition of the ocean, they evolved into amphibians to live on the barren shores. He quickly turned to his notes. He recorded the third era, the Neolife era, where a massive explosion of diverse animals occurred and the first marine life flourished. Invertebrates relied on shells to dominate the seas as overlords, but their reign was short-lived once the first vertebrates were born. Using their superior agility, the vertebrates defeated them to become the new masters, eventually crawling out of the sea to rule for ages. Finishing his notes, he silently closed the black notebook. Although his children were evolving into land creatures, he felt a lingering doubt. He wondered how long it would take for intelligent life to emerge. On a sudden whim, he considered dripping his own blood into the mix. But that idea was far too bold. Being cautious, he decided to experiment with other genes first and headed to the zoo. Using a university project as an excuse, he bought a blood sample from a gorilla. By the time he returned to the orchard, the entire 100-acre miniature sandbox had transformed into a small ecological world, with mountains covered in green and strange trees on the plains. Animals were even swimming in the rivers as he stepped back into this massive, experimental field of his own making. We see him finally select a creature shaped like a small beetle, releasing them into a brand new experimental field only 1 square meter in size. After injecting the gorilla blood, he accelerated the flow of time, watching as those who couldn't survive the rejection died off entirely. Tens of millions of these beetle-like species perished in just 2 days, but among the survivors, he found a glimmer of hope. He selected a small group where the blood fusion was most successful, naming this new species the insectoid gardeners. These creatures looked remarkably human, though with one distinct difference, a circular black armor plate growing from their backs. It took 2 full days to refine these black jade insectoids, which meant 20,000 years had already passed within the sandbox. Powerful new species had emerged, with trees soaring into the clouds and a massive explosion of giant organisms taking hold. This meant the sandbox had entered a terrifying era similar to the Jurassic, dominated by beasts with black discs upon their heads. These creatures had reached his set size limit, about the size of a house cat, as he prepared his experimental insectoids for release. He placed them into a lush canyon in the south, wondering how these small beings would survive in such a brutal age. He adjusted the time flow to 100 years per day, and early the next morning, he rushed back to check on them. To his absolute delight, as he observed the group of insectoids, he realized they had exceeded his expectations. They had already developed a primitive tribal structure and even a basic language, though a new worry began to surface. They were simply too weak. Their 20,000-year-old genes were no match for the giant beasts of this new era. He couldn't just stand by and watch his hard-won creations go extinct, so he decided to grant them the sparks of civilization. He ordered a miniature silver pine bonsai online and commissioned a custom-made alloy sword, no thicker than a needle's tip. By the time these 2 finely crafted items arrived, a day and a half had passed in his world, a lifetime for his subjects. For the insectoids, 150 years had gone by, and their numbers were now dwindling toward total disappearance. Yet, he felt a strange sense of pride. Surviving for over a century in such a world proved they had incredible potential. And so, after slowing the time flow back to a 1-to-1 ratio, he stepped into the sandbox to meet them. By this time, the insectoid gardener tribe was in a state of absolute ruin, their fragile balance completely shattered. Several male insectoids let out low, guttural growls, signaling for the women and children behind them to retreat immediately. They brandished clubs made from the bones of unknown beasts, charging towards several pitch-black predators known as dark claws. We see the women and young ones fleeing in desperation, their faces etched with the singular, haunting desire to survive. They seemed tragically accustomed to this life of flight, while the males who had charged were already becoming food for the dark claws. As blood splattered across the dirt, he watched from above with a heavy heart. The primitive tribe's losses were simply too devastating. As he strode forward, the fleeing insectoids felt the very earth tremble beneath them within the ancient, wild forest. Countless beasts took flight in terror as massive swarms of creatures scattered, and mountains seemed to flatten under his advance. Some of the most powerful species didn't even have time to react before being crushed by a foot descending from the heavens. He quickly caught up to the fleeing soldiers, and as he passed, he casually stepped on the dark claws devouring the corpses. The survivors looked back in horror, wondering what kind of impossible creature could be so unimaginably large. To them, he was 10,000 times larger than the greatest beasts, easily crushing the dark claws they feared so much. The insectoids turned their heads to see a vast being whose head reached the clouds, like an ancient giant piercing the sky. They screamed in terror, their legs giving out instantly. He, however, could understand every word of their primitive language. He paid their shock little mind. After all, to them, he was nothing less than a creator. Run, we have to run. But they knew they couldn't escape a being to whom they were no larger than a single hair, and many collapsed in despair. Yet, amidst the cries of the crowd, a single young insectoid stubbornly lifted his head toward the sky and shouted at him, "You giant beast, are you here to eat us too? You've already killed my father, my mother, and our strongest warriors." The child cried out, asking why they were so weak. He found himself genuinely surprised by the young creature's bravery. With a sudden spark of inspiration, he decided this child would be the one, gently reaching down to lift him into his palm. In an instant, the young creature's mind went completely blank as the giant's palm descended, appearing as vast and boundless as a great plain. To the giant, the child was no larger than a single fine line on his skin, yet the boy looked up to see eyes like twin suns. They shone like the most brilliant stars in the sky, primarily because he had shielded his true face from the species within the sandbox. All they could perceive was a blurred visage radiating a hazy, divine glow as he held the tiny insectoid in his palm with a calm gaze. "Gilgamesh," he spoke softly, "do you wish to change all of this?" The young insectoid began to tremble violently at the sound. Standing upon that massive hand, the child screamed in disbelief, realizing that this impossible being could actually communicate. He wondered how a giant of such stature could possess wisdom, and why he had been given the name Gilgamesh. The giant brought his hand level with his eyes, and replied calmly that a name is one of the first true manifestations of wisdom. Gilgamesh stood on the palm, suddenly overcome with emotion, realizing they were both intelligent beings capable of understanding one another. He demanded to know why such a powerful and magnificent being wouldn't save them, having no idea what the giant truly was. The child assumed he was merely a colossal version of a wise beast, and the giant saw no reason to explain otherwise as he carried him. He strode across mountains and rivers, each step flattening vast forests and crushing lesser creatures beneath his weight. He commanded the weak insectoid to look down, his voice booming like thunder across the horizon as he told him to observe the world. He explained that every species is equal. The insectoids were no different from the plants or animals, so why should he favor them? He asked if they deserved salvation simply because they were intelligent, leaving Gilgamesh speechless and spiraling into despair. The child cried out, asking why the giant had come at all if not to help, but the answer was cold. No one was coming to save them. He told the boy that only they could save themselves, though he was willing to grant them the tools of civilization to make it possible. Gilgamesh stood frozen on the giant's palm, watching in absolute awe as he experienced the world from the clouds for the first time. The vast lands, mountains, and winding rivers all shrank beneath his gaze, appearing like mere toys from such a height. Countless beasts scurried and roared beneath the giant's feet, creating a scene of such immense scale that it defied all comprehension. We see a landscape of such magnificent, fantastical beauty from this height, yet it is matched only by the terrifying and overwhelming sense of power. Trembling, the creature asked what civilization truly was, a question the giant hadn't initially planned to answer for this newborn race. After a moment of reflection, he offered his own definition. Civilization is a spark, it is knowledge, and it is order. More importantly, it is the formidable power that intelligent species use to protect themselves, a concept that left the young one in a daze. He placed Gilgamesh upon his shoulder and strode back toward the Great Canyon, where the next phase of his plan awaited. From his bag, he took a small ginkgo sapling and planted it in the soil. To him, it was a mere 60 centimeters tall. But for this miniature land, it was an endless divine tree piercing the clouds, its crown lost in a swirling mist of ice. He told the boy that if he truly desired the power of civilization, he must show courage and climb this sacred tree. This was to be a trial of both wisdom and bravery. As he spoke, he placed a custom-made metal greatsword at the very top. Beside it, he laid a match soaked in oil and a small capsule containing termite genes, a leftover from his earlier experiments. His voice boomed across the sky once more, announcing that these were the three sacred treasures of civilization. First was the Sword of Judgment, the weapon meant to protect their society from the chaos of the outside world. He explained that unlike the savages roaming the earth, a truly intelligent species is defined by its ability to master tools. Second was the Torch, a bridge of burning flame that would serve as the very enlightenment of their budding culture. Third was the Blood of Power, a gift intended only for the world's fiercest warriors who could survive its grueling baptism. He warned that while it granted unparalleled strength, failure to endure it meant certain death, a heavy price for a heavy burden. If the boy wished to change the fate of his people, he had to reach the summit before the torch's flame flickered out. With that, he gently set the tiny insectoid back on the ground and departed, his massive footsteps echoing through the mountains. The moment he stepped out of the orchard, he accelerated the sandbox's time by 100-fold, turning seconds into days for those within. Finally, he picked up his binoculars to get a clear view of the drama now unfolding beneath the shadow of the divine tree. Young Jirgamesher began to climb the divine tree with a face full of grim determination. In our eyes, the way this little creature moved up the trunk was as fast as a darting insect. In just a few seconds, he fell countless times, only to struggle back up again. After about 10 seconds, he finally reached the very top of the divine tree. But in reality, for Jirgamesher inside the sandbox, he could no longer remember how long he had been climbing or how many times he had failed. Standing atop the lush, emerald crown, Jirgamesher held the sword high and seemed to be shouting something, before quickly descending the tree like a flickering shadow. This moment was destined to be etched into eternity. Thousands of years later, in the lands where the ancient Yamli dynasty once flourished, a civilization that was as magnificent as it was fleeting, archaeologists would eventually uncover the truth of this era. They found the historical hymns of the Yamli, written by the first people for their great king. This most ancient of documents was called Genesis. The ancient Yamli people had built a kingdom on this land that was both incredibly prosperous and tragically short-lived. Through these archaeological finds, we see the hymns of praise that the ancestors composed for their legendary sovereign. This foundational text, the genesis of their world, was finally brought to light by modern researchers. It contained the epic songs of the Yamli history, dedicated to the great king and preserved within the pages of Genesis. The ancient records describe a giant of wisdom, 10,000 feet tall, with a holy countenance, who walked across the mountains and rivers. He bestowed the trial of the divine tree and the three treasures of civilization upon the young hero king, Jirgamesher. When our observer woke up the next morning, a long century had already passed within the orchard sandbox world. For the insectoids, who have an average lifespan of 40 to 50 years, 2 entire generations had gone by. He felt a spark of anticipation. He wondered if that young, inexperienced Jirgamesher had already passed away from old age. The answer, surprisingly, was no. Had he died? Not at all. In fact, he had a major surprise in store. During the first 10 years after the giant's departure, Jirgamesher led his people through their continued exodus, marveling at the incredible things they had discovered. They learned that fire could cook their food, drive away massive beasts at night, and provide warmth during the freezing darkness. It was no wonder the giant of wisdom had said fire represents the origin of civilization. As for that sort of judgment, it proved to be an invincible weapon in this primitive jungle. With its razor-sharp edge, Jirgamesher slaughtered countless beasts, giving his struggling people the power to finally fight back. During the second decade, Jirgamesher shed his youthful greenness and entered his 30s. He grew majestic and tall, becoming the strongest hunter of the insectoid race, known to the tribe as the Hero King. He even used fire to clear the land, making it fertile to begin primitive farming. He was peerless, arrogant, and utterly domineering, a true absolute ruler. The giant of wisdom had placed the three treasures of civilization in his hands, and he understood clearly that civilization is the inheritance of knowledge and history. Thus, he boldly pioneered cuneiform script to record their story. He innovated their language, believing himself to be the first wise man to open the civilized world. To document his creation, he recorded history in books and composed hymns, shamelessly naming the collection Genesis. He ruled with a heavy, tyrannical hand. Despite being an autocratic dictator, he possessed immense personal charisma. Within the tribe, he had 131 wives. Most of his descendants were strong and powerful, inheriting his stature and wisdom. However, the average insectoid lifespan is only 30 to 40 years. By now, Jirgamesher was already in his late 30s. The same man who once wielded the sword of judgment, the wild and bold Hero King, had finally reached the twilight of his life. Inside a house crafted from sturdy timber, a fire blazed in the hearth. Jirgamesher sat calmly upon a massive chair woven from the furs of dark claw beasts. Gazing at the flames, he whispered to himself that this was the fire of civilization bestowed by the giant of wisdom. Jirgamesher's once tall and imposing frame had grown frail with age. He turned his head to look at the walls, where the skulls of various giant beasts hung as trophies. His life had been magnificent enough, splendid enough to fulfill every dream of his youth. He was satisfied. The next tribal leader had already been chosen. His son, Artoria, whose abilities were no less than his own and who could lead the tribe toward continued glory. Jirgamesher could clearly feel his life force gradually drifting toward its inevitable end. Death is unavoidable for any living creature, and he had almost accepted his fate until he quietly took out the vial. It was the blood of power from years ago. Now that his people were safe, he had no more lingering worries. He recalled the giant of wisdom saying that only the most courageous warrior in the world could survive consuming this third treasure. He wondered if he truly was that most courageous warrior. He decided to find out. The Hero King's eyes, clouded by age, suddenly flickered with a faint, sharp light. In a daze, the echoes of his glorious years resounded in his mind. Suddenly, he felt a surge of emotion. As memories of his legendary life flashed by, he shed a silent tear and calmly cut into his own arm. He poured the blood of power into the wound, and an unimaginable, searing pain instantly washed over him. Gilgamesh collapsed to the ground, struggling. This aging hero had survived countless battles in his life, yet he had never gasped in such agonizing pain. Eventually, however, he managed to endure the brush with death. As he slowly stood up, we see his long hair had shed its natural color, turning a striking, brilliant white. His face was now as perfect and youthful as a god's. Inside the wooden house, he felt a change. The muscular, white-haired young man whispered to himself, marveling at the potency of the blood of power. It was a truly magnificent strength. At this moment, Gilgamesh could feel it clearly. A continuous, surging power rising from within. Meanwhile, in the village, his son Artoria was taking action. Artoria stood on high ground, raising the sword of judgment to announce his succession as the new leader. He was wise and virtuous. Compared to his arrogant father, he seemed a much more compassionate ruler. Gilgamesh had known this and was willing to step down in his old age, but now, everything had changed. Artoria was kind and deeply loved by the people. He respected his father and never intended to seize power by force. But for Gilgamesh, no potential threat could be allowed to remain. He returned, declaring himself the leader once more. The throne was still his. On that day, blood was spilled and cries of sorrow echoed throughout the Yamli tribe. The hero King Gilgamesh reclaimed his position from his son, beginning a second life of absolute rule. During the first decade of this second life, he led his people to use stone to build sturdy houses. The tribe was reunited, officially entering an era of resistance against the giant beasts without needing the blood of power. Gilgamesh now possessed the termite gene, allowing him to uproot century-old trees and wield the strength of mountains. He led his people against the monsters for 13 years before choosing to challenge the most terrifying existence on Earth. This was the termite behemoth, Finba, rumored to possess the greatest strength in the entire world. Finba was the sovereign king of the era of giants, the very creature that had reached the size limit of the sandbox. Gilgamesh fought Finba for 3 days and nights as the earth cracked and canyons were utterly destroyed. Countless beasts fled the forest in terror during that monumental struggle. On that day, everything changed. The people of the tribes were filled with pride and shock, writing hymns to praise his incredible power. He was the strongest hero king in history. Upon his return, looking at his people, he suddenly declared his intent to found a nation. In an instant, the tribe erupted in excitement. The people wept with joy, knowing exactly what this meant. Under the leadership of this great hero king, their days of wandering and displacement were finally over. They no longer had to fear the brutality of the giants. A new era of civilization had begun, and as we know, history is written by the victors. Gilgamesh did not record the atrocities committed against his son, choosing instead to document his own heroic deeds in the Genesis. His bravery was immortalized within the annals of the Yamli dynasty, where his legends were carefully preserved. The records state that Gilgamesh took the blood of power, slew the legendary beast Finba, and moved massive stones to surround them. He established the first city-state in history, the City of Standing Stones, as time continued to march forward. Our story continues as the Emperor Gilgamesh began to focus all his efforts on developing civilization across the entire land. He was a man of immense charisma, yet he was also peerlessly tyrannical, creating currency and perfecting the language for his people. While he built great cities, he also cruelly divided his subjects into rigid social classes, exhausting the people's resources for his own whims. He dispatched countless warriors to explore the very boundaries of the world, remaining, in their eyes, the great hero king. But he was also an absolute tyrant. By the 87th year of the Yamli dynasty, Gilgamesh had reached the age of 127. The City of Standing Stones had reached a staggering population of tens of millions, where countless slaves were traded daily. He even established colosseums for the nobles' entertainment, while the original tribesmen who knew the old ways had long since passed away. As centuries of time flowed by, the descendants no longer remembered the hardships and struggles their ancestors once endured. In their comfort, they slowly drifted toward decay, yet the king of Yamli remained as imposing and shadow-shrouded as ever. Inside the dim and heavy halls of the royal palace of Standing Stones, we see a tall, handsome man standing before us. He stood calmly before an exquisite throne of white bone, with the legendary sword never leaving his side. This was the Sword of Rupture, held by the great king of Yamli and lord of the realm, His Majesty Gilgamesh. One of his ministers, a man named Hanmin, approached to report that they had finally finished exploring the entire land. Hanmin spoke with a trembling, fanatical energy, eager to recount the discoveries made across the vast world. As the palace minister and new envoy, Hanmin passionately described everything they had witnessed during these long years of travel. Gilgamesh stared intently at the minister, asking simply, "What is the nature of our world?" His sharp gaze seemed to pierce through the palace walls toward the blue sky, thinking of the warriors who had sought the truth. After decades of travel and countless casualties, those who set out in all directions had finally returned with an answer. Hanmin gestured respectfully, if not a bit hyperbolically, claiming that their world consisted of a round sky and a square earth. He described the sky as an infinitely high lake of clouds, while the ground beneath them was a perfect, unchanging square. In the center lies a vast ocean, surrounded by a landscape of mountains and winding rivers. Across this incredibly immense land, even if one were to ride the fastest flying beast in a straight line, it would still take more than 20 years to travel between the world's opposite edges. Gilgamesh remained silent on his throne for a long moment before simply saying, "Very well, you may leave." "Yes, your majesty," Hanmin replied, rising to leave. Yet he paused to steal one last worshipful glance at his king. This great hero king had led them out of the caves, founded their tribes, and moved them from farming into the Stone Age. He had ushered in the era of city-states and personally slaughtered Finba, the most terrifying of the giant beast kings. He had guided one era of civilization after another. 30 years ago, Hanmin had been nothing more than a young ranger. He was summoned to the palace by his majesty and ordered to map the geography of the entire realm. By the time he returned to the city of Standing Stones to complete his mission, he was no longer a youth. Instead, he was now a trembling old man with clouded eyes, nearing the end of his days. He knew he didn't have much longer to live, yet his king remained exactly as he had been in the past. There wasn't a single trace of time's passage on the monarch, a fact that made Hanmin's aged body tremble with awe. His eyes were filled with fanaticism. For over a century, His Majesty had no longer needed to display his true power. His strength had reached unknown heights, and perhaps this immortal king would lead the Yanli people into the next great age. We see the palace grow empty as Gilgamesh reflects on the description of their world as a round sky and square earth. He let out a long, heavy sigh and gently stroked the great sword beside him as if it were a lifelong companion. It was the one constant throughout his endless years, and he realized he had finally mastered the power of the torch. He had thoroughly unraveled the secrets of the blood of power, yet the truth of the sword of rupture eluded him. Despite searching the entire world, Gilgamesh whispered in shock. He still could not fathom how it was forged. He wondered what material it could possibly be, the bone of some ancient beast, or perhaps the craft of a lost civilization. Unfortunately, this world was not a true reality. No ores or minerals had ever been buried within this sandbox. Because no metals existed in the earth, the civilization growing within the sandbox was destined to remain limited. They were bound to remain forever in the Stone Age, at least according to their own understanding of the world. The very concept of metal would never exist for them. To this world, that glittering, unbreakable object was unique. This indestructible material was mysterious, powerful, and one of a kind. They had even searched to the ends of the earth. They had reached the very edge of the world, yet they still hadn't found that great, wise being from the old legends. Despite searching every corner of the realm, they failed to find the great beast of wisdom who had appeared so long ago. He wondered where such a creature could possibly live, for the civilization the great beast possessed was beyond his imagination. It was truly impossible to fathom. This sword of rupture, which had been gifted to him, was a mystery he couldn't solve. Though he cherished it like a divine treasure, this holy sword that had carved out an entire civilization also served as a warning. He realized that the power known as civilization was something he had only partially mastered. The rest remained a vast unknown, and the secrets of this blade were a constant reminder of his own limitations. The mystery of how it was forged filled him with a deep sense of dread. To him, the sword of rupture felt like an omen. It was like a legendary blade suspended by a single thread, hanging high and silent above his head. He felt it could fall at any moment, ready to take his life without warning. The power of civilization was truly something to yearn for. Meanwhile, Gilgamesh sat motionless upon his throne. Like a sleeping lion in a deep valley, his gaze drifted toward the distance as he recalled a memory from over a century ago. In those distant, long-forgotten years, he remembered a massive figure, a colossal giant of staggering height. Radiating a holy light, that giant had held his younger self in a wide palm, looking down upon the mountains and rivers. The moment he was granted the three treasures of civilization remained the most unforgettable scene of his entire life. It was all so vivid, as if it had happened only yesterday. But unfortunately, his long life was finally nearing its end. He realized that the study of power and strength could no longer help him stave off the inevitable. He desperately wanted to live a third lifetime. He longed to see the great beast of wisdom just one more time. But we see that at this very moment, I was simply chatting and having dinner with the girl next door. I didn't hear Gilgamesh's prayers, and to be honest, even if I had, I likely wouldn't have interfered. A life destined to end must eventually fade, for no one can be truly immortal. Gilgamesh had already lived a legendary life that even I found myself envying, a lifetime of glory and the adoration of his people. What more could he possibly regret? Yet, I underestimated his sheer desperation to cling to life after facing death once before. Having felt that deep, primal fear, the heroic monarch was now terrified of the end and obsessed with a third life. In the 102nd year of the Yanli dynasty, Gilgamesh reached the age of 142. For a man with triple a normal lifespan, the legendary king saw his face finally growing old. He was consumed by a rage that shook the entire world. He ordered the entire nation to find the great beast, while summoning eccentrics to concoct medicines and study dark magic. During this time, countless massive beasts within the primeval forest were slaughtered in a desperate search for a cure. Their various parts were used for experiments, and the once thriving dark claw species was driven nearly to extinction. History thus entered the infamous era of the tyrant city-states. 13 years later, a court warlock finally created a longevity elixir. It successfully extended Gilgameş's life, but a resistance to the drugs soon developed. After multiple doses, it lost all effect. Gilgamesh began to slide once more toward an unstoppable decline. Death is something no living creature can avoid, not even the greatest of heroes. By the 145th year of the dynasty, another 30 years had passed, and Gilgamesh could feel his very life force rapidly fading away. The once mighty old man sat motionless upon his throne, closing his eyes as he contemplated the future of his people. He began the search for a successor, and soon the entire dynasty was in an uproar. The great king was finally dying. It seemed impossible that the immortal hero king, Gilgamesh, was actually reaching the end of his long journey. Yet, for a time, no one dared to step forward. We must remember what happened the last time his life began to fade. He had named his trusted son, Artoria, as the next leader, only to kill him personally after regaining his youth. Naturally, everyone was terrified of becoming the next Artoria. However, Gilgamesh remained a brilliant strategist. He issued a direct decree. The chosen candidates for the throne would be granted the sacred blood of power. They would possess a might comparable to his own, so they would no longer have any reason to fear him. Furthermore, they would be given the right to lead their own followers and establish a second royal city. The promise of the blood of power and the right to build a city spread like wildfire through the land. The entire nation was shocked. Countless merchants, slaves, commoners, and nobles alike were drawn to the prospect. Aristocrats and craftsmen swarmed the palace gates, but many who passed the trials still met a grim end. Most died from rejecting the blood of power. Only the forest warrior Lichadu and the plain smith Randall survived the ordeal. Each established their own city-state, and thus two new kings emerged, ready to take over the mantle of power. They were destined to succeed the aging Gilgamesh and guide the next generation of the Yanli civilization. Civilization had begun with Gilgamesh, but he knew it could not be allowed to end with him. By the 175th year of the Yanli dynasty, three kings stood together, ruling the world in an uneasy but functional balance. The city-states entered an era of unprecedented prosperity, just as Gilgamesh felt death's final approach. He began one last struggle against the inevitable, summoning craftsmen to build a temple far grander than the Hall of Heroes. This was to be the temple of the great beast of wisdom, a massive stone sanctuary where he hoped to find salvation. Within the temple stood a colossal statue of a giant, a majestic figure radiating a vast and boundless light. With one hand, it cradled the young hero king, Gilgamesh, its blue eyes gazing down upon the entire world. The statue exuded an astonishing, ashen divinity, and on that day, Gilgamesh led his ministers to the site. He brought millions of his subjects to worship the great beast of wisdom, hoping the great lord would hear them. He wanted to show his absolute sincerity, hoping to see the great beast of wisdom just once more before dying. As he looked up, tears began to stream down Gilgamesh's withered face. It had been nearly a century, after all. Facing his own end, the king led his entire court in prayer, pleading for a second meeting with the great beast. He cried out to the heavens, begging the great beast of wisdom to appear before him one last time. The hero king's final ambition was simply to see the mysterious being who had once gifted him the three treasures. Because the matter of life and death was so significant, the creator, who was out walking with his sister, noticed the plea. Upon receiving the message from the master brain, he felt a wave of nostalgia and decided to grant the meeting. He needed to see this old friend, and frankly, it was time to stop the destruction of the other species. In just a few days of accelerated time, they had ruined countless ecosystems and caused the extinction of many species. And all of this destruction had been carried out solely to fuel Gilgamesh's desperate dream of eternal life. The creator restored the flow of time to its normal speed and stepped directly into the world of the sandbox. In that moment, for the creatures within, the ground began to vibrate. The mountains, rivers, and oceans all trembled. It seemed as if the very earth was shuddering as trees were crushed and massive footprints were left in the valleys. Countless beasts fled through the dense forests in a panic as the presence drew closer. Gradually, the world changed. The entire royal city began to shake. The people wondered in fear if the stone temples were finally collapsing. At that moment, while Gilgamesh was leading his ministers in worship, he suddenly sensed a familiar presence. For the first time in decades, the aged face of this great hero king lit up with the pure, wide-eyed wonder of a child. After 200 long years, he was finally looking upon the great Lord of Wisdom once again. The great beast of wisdom, the one who had gifted him the three treasures of civilization, had finally returned. As we see the creator looking down, he marveled slightly at the massive city, which housed over 10 million people. To him, it was no larger than a basketball court, but it was an impressive feat for such tiny creatures to build. He looked toward the exquisite altars and temples, and there, beneath the towering stone statues, The snow-white, elderly king looked up, clutching the sword of ruin as tears of gold and silver streamed down his face. The creator gazed down at the weeping old man, feeling a sudden, heavy wave of nostalgia for his old friend. He remembered the shy, young creature he once held in his palm, the boy who had stood atop the giant tree. That hot-blooded youth who once roared at the heavens with sword in hand was now at the very end of his life. Yet, that ambitious young version of Gilgamesh felt as though he had existed only yesterday. "Have you lived well all these years?" the creator asked, his voice piercing through the vast layers of clouds. As the voice descended upon the bustling royal city, Gilgamesh trembled, leaning heavily on his holy sword. "I suppose I have lived well enough," he replied, his throat dry and raspy as he stared into the sky. Even though this wasn't the first time he had seen the cloud-piercing giant, he was still overwhelmed by the sight. The colossal figure rose straight into the heavens, its torso appearing to hold up the very fabric of the world. A dense radiance obscured the giant's face, while a pure, sacred light shimmered through the breaks in the clouds. The giant looked down upon the entire city, appearing dark, solemn, and utterly majestic all at once. It was a holy sight, one that no words could truly describe. It seemed impossible that such a being actually existed. Across the city, 10 million people, from wealthy merchants in fine leather to slaves in tattered rags, all stopped in their tracks. Every commoner and craftsman dropped their tools and stepped out of their homes, filling the streets to witness the impossible. They looked up at the vast giant piercing the heavens, the legendary great beast of wisdom who had gifted them civilization. It truly was a colossal being, standing tens of thousands of feet tall. What a magnificent form of life this was. Comparable to the sun, moon, and stars themselves, everyone was lost in a state of shock, their minds blank with awe. Fear, wonder, and 1,000 complex emotions intertwined, eventually transforming into a sense of incomparable adoration. Gilgamesh looked at the shocked expressions of his palace ministers and let out a soft, knowing laugh. He remembered having that same terrified feeling when he first met the great beast, and he fell silent for a moment. Gilgamesh looked up with a gaze full of longing. "Great beast of wisdom," he began, his voice trembling slightly. With eyes full of yearning, he continued, "More than 100 years ago, you gave me a mission." He spoke of the legacy of civilization he had built, proving he had succeeded. High above, from 10,000 meters up, the voice of the vast, eternal giant pierced through the thick layers of clouds and descended upon the city below. The creator spoke to the hero king, telling him his achievements would be recorded in the books his people had written. In the genesis of the Epic of Yamli, he would forever be known as Gilgamesh, the greatest first-generation hero king. Future generations would write hymns in his honor, and his glory would endure for thousands of years after his passing. But living on only through spoken epics and stories was not what the old king truly wanted. Gilgamesh suddenly became agitated, prompting the giant to ask what it was he truly desired. "I want an eternal life, just like yours," Gilgamesh cried out, looking up at the giant towering into the clouds. Driven by an absolute, desperate longing, he declared he was willing to sacrifice everything and pay any price. He begged for the treasure of immortality, but upon hearing these words, the creator simply remained silent. At this very moment, this great monarch already possessed almost everything in the world: glory, power, and limitless wealth. Even the entire world belonged to him, yet he remained unsatisfied. He craved the eternal life he saw before him. Deep down, he felt the weight of his terminal illness, knowing death could claim him at any moment. He was envious. It was the end of Gilgamesh's magnificent life, a life that had read like an epic chapter in history. The creator told him he was too greedy, for there was no treasure of immortality to give. He watched the king calmly. Before him stood a king withering with age. Birth, aging, and death are natural laws that cannot be rewritten. At the end of life, everyone longs to live on. Status and power are leveled to nothing in that final moment. Across the vast scales of countless civilizations, it is always the same, whether one is an emperor or a mere ant. The giant took one last deep look at Gilgamesh, looking down at the dynasty below with a sense of profound emotion. "Impossible," Gilgamesh forced out, his throat hoarse as he stared up into the sky at the giant's form. He looked at that sacred face surrounded by clouds and accused the giant of lying, certain the power existed. With a burning gaze, he looked at the creator, who stood as majestic and towering as a mountain range. The giant's body was as robust as solid rock. Over 200 long years, even after drinking the blood of power, the king had grown old, yet time had left no mark whatsoever on this magnificent, eternal being. To the giant, time seemed like a fleeting yesterday. To Gilgamesh, the great beast of wisdom was immortal. What an incredible power that was, a lifespan so long it was enough to make anyone covet it. His lips trembled, and Gilgamesh suddenly roared toward the heavens, asking if the giant had only come for one reason. "Have you come only to witness my death?" he cried, feeling like a humble and pathetic creature in that moment. The creator replied that he had come to see him off, not because he had the power to extend his life. He had also come to deliver a second warning for the civilization. The giant sighed and continued speaking. He told the king that their civilization had become too cruel, exterminating surrounding creatures and destroying the forests. The creator spoke of the slaughter of great beasts and the trampling of the continent, warning that true civilization is neither cruel nor barbaric. He demanded an end to the killing. Yet, despite his advanced age, Gilgamesh remained remarkably robust and defiant. He suddenly stood up, his body trembling, while a fire seemed to ignite within his eyes, burning brighter with every passing second. This white-haired old man took a sudden, forceful step forward, his spirit surging with an intensity that defied his years. He declared that the slaughter would never stop, and that his own relentless march forward would never be halted. He asked the giant if he realized that the Gwari sword, given to him all those years ago, had changed everything. It had hung over his head like a shadow. While it granted him immense power, it also brought a heavy burden. It had instilled in him an unparalleled fear, but today, that fear would finally be addressed. He intended to draw this divine sword with his own hands, calling out for his historian, Bhagwan, to witness the moment. He summoned the official responsible for the Genesis records to document the history of their civilization at this very moment. As the king prepared to speak, the historian Bhagwan silently lifted his brush upon the red platform, ready to record. He spread out a roll of gray parchment, asking His Majesty to begin the account of humanity's struggle against nature. The king spoke of a history defined by courage and hymns, explaining that his original intent for the Genesis was to preserve this legacy. He wanted to leave the truth for future generations, and now, the most pivotal chapter was about to be written. He decided to let history record his courage in this moment, so that future generations would understand. Gilgamesh took a heavy, ragged breath, his lungs straining as he prepared for what came next. Leaning his aged body against the Gwari sword, he gave a grim smile, and then raised his voice to a thunderous shout. In the 175th year of the Yanli dynasty, after a lifetime of slaying legends and conquering the world, the hero Gilgamesh, who had reigned as king for over a century, prepared to make his final move. Using the entire strength of his kingdom to lure the great beast of wisdom into the open, he prepared to swing his sword at a god. As he prepared to slay the great beast of wisdom, we watched from above, feeling a complex mix of surprise and anticipation. Last time it was his own son. This time, he intends to strike a god. The creator soon regains his composure, observing Gilgamesh's actions. His move seems incredibly bold, yet in a way, it makes perfect sense. After facing death once and being reborn, this hero king changed. First, he killed his own beloved son. Now, facing death a second time, he chooses to swing his sword at the one who granted him civilization. Perhaps, right from the very beginning, this outcome was inevitable. We see now what it truly means when a brave child dares to roar and question a giant standing 10,000 feet tall. He has never known fear in his entire life, so it is only natural that he would eventually turn his blade toward the heavens. It is simply his nature. The creator remains calm, issuing one final warning. Gilgamesh, I am warning you for the last time. He is told to stop this reckless venture, for it is barbarism, not civilization. Every action from here on will have consequences. He is warned that he will pay a heavy price, and to be honest, there is no price heavier than death itself. Gilgamesh slowly opens his blood-red eyes, looking as though he has returned to the prime of his youth. A long-lost, youthful madness flickers within him. It is the same desperate resolve he felt all those years ago. Just as he once slew Finbo with no regard for his own life, today he intends to slay the great beast of wisdom. His goal is to seize its civilization, steal its power, and finally achieve true immortality. With a thunderous roar, Gilgamesh declares that he will lead his people to challenge the divine. This marks the very first collision between two civilizations, a moment where a developing society challenges its maker. They are challenging a unique, supreme being. Even if that being once guided them, it doesn't seem to matter now. To the king, the creator is now merely an obstacle blocking their path forward. He raises his long sword high into the air. The wild wind whips through his messy silver hair as he stands there, defiant and unrestrained. And just at that moment, a distant bell echoes throughout the entire capital. In an instant, the city of martyrs begins to boil with frantic energy. An army of hundreds of thousands pours out, forming dense and orderly ranks across the landscape. We watch this unfold and realize with a sigh that Gilgamesh had been preparing for this for over a decade. His plan to strike the great beast of wisdom was set. Today was merely a trap to lure the creator out. If his terms weren't met, he would kill his maker, a bold, calculated move from a truly great tyrant. At the same time, in a massive city on the distant plains, the barbarian General Randall stands calmly before his palace. Even from such a vast distance, he can still see the giant towering high into the clouds. Randall is shaken by the sight of such a perfect, colossal being, his pupils shrinking in a mix of awe and focus. He knows it is time to act. After all, given Gilgamesh's tyrannical nature, he wouldn't share power easily. The only reason the king would ever offer the precious blood of power to others was to secure allies for this very moment. He had been planning for this since the beginning. Suddenly, Randall draws his sword with a sharp metallic ring. Exhibiting the fierce spirit of the plains people, he lets out a thunderous cry, "To war!" History will surely remember this moment. It is the 175th year of the Yanli dynasty. The Yanli people intend to slay the great beast of wisdom and return with the blood of immortality. Meanwhile, we turn to the divine tree near the capital, the ancient spire once used to test the three treasures of civilization. A bustling forest city now thrives atop this tree that pierces the sky. At its very summit, the forest warrior Lichidu stands leaning heavily on his wooden staff. He gazes silently at the terrifying giant in the distance, while his disciples stand quietly behind him. One of them speaks up, suggesting that it is time for their teacher and their people to set out. But Lichidu shakes his head. He decides that their forest city will take no part in this conflict. Lichidu sighs as he looks toward the royal capital, even though it is barely a speck on the horizon. The sheer, terrifying pressure of that giant weighs so heavily on his heart that he can barely breathe. One of his more blunt disciples can't help but ask if the three kings are finally joining forces. He wonders if even the beast of wisdom can stand against them, but Lichidu clarifies it isn't fear. He isn't afraid of death itself, but rather of discarding something far more precious than his own life. His sense of civilization and wisdom prevents him from acting like a common, bloodthirsty beast. To turn against the great beast, the very being who gave them civilization and saved their race, is unthinkable. Without gratitude or morality, they would be no different from wild animals, leaving his disciples in silence. Their teacher is a legend, a hero of the forest who survived the trial of power to lead them. Yet now, he chooses to defy the royal decree, knowing full well that such a choice is unforgivable. He calmly instructs them to take his head if the king emerges victorious in the coming battle. They are to carry it to the palace as proof of his crime, for he knows the king's nature all too well. Under such a tyranny, he is already a dead man. He insists this defiance was his alone. He begs that the city be spared, but if the beast wins, they must take his head to the giant instead. They must offer it as a plea for forgiveness, showing the great creator that some still remember the truth. It is his hope the giant will see they are true heirs of civilization, not just mindless savages. He prays this gesture might save their race from extinction, leaving behind a single spark of hope. Lichidu stands at the summit of the divine tree, spreading his arms wide in a final, heavy silence. With a sudden, grim determination, a blade flashes and Lichidu's head is severed by his own disciple. The Forest King, one of the strongest heroes of the Yanli civilization, offered no resistance in his final moments. The disciple gazes at the calm, familiar face of his master before silently wrapping the head in animal hide. Suddenly, a sharp pang of sorrow strikes his heart, and he senses that something vital in his life is slowly shattering. On the ground, we see the elite Yanli army, a force of countless archers and cavalry. But to the giant, they are merely a swarm of ants, their sharp arrows posing no real threat. As we might have guessed, the elite troops that once conquered the forest and its beasts are utterly useless against the beast of wisdom. Just as that thought settles, Jirjiamaishi suddenly makes a massive leap, moving with a speed that defies his small stature. In the blink of an eye, he reaches the giant's knee. It is truly impressive, an ant jumping like a flea. Such terrifying, explosive power suggests this will not be simple. The giant swings a hand to swat him, but the aging hero king skillfully dodges, leaping across the giant's denim trousers to climb higher. His expression remains grimly serious as he realizes the true scale of the beast of wisdom. The mere wind from the giant's casual movements is enough to nearly blow him away. Suddenly, the barbarian General Randall arrives to provide support, leaping toward the fray. The creature leaped an incredible 7 or 8 meters, clinging to his pant leg as he reached out to grab Randall. The giant reaches out to grab him, but the king of the grasslands proves to be just as agile. Having fought giant beasts for years, his combat skills are refined. He truly earns his royal title. The giant acknowledges their skill, but decides that this little test has gone on long enough. With a sudden burst of speed, he swats at Randall, who finds himself unable to react in time. The warrior is sent flying. A second later, the giant strikes at Jirjiamaishi with overwhelming force. The hero king is shocked. He has only a fraction of a second to respond to the incoming palm. He fires a stunning arrow to shield himself, but the impact sends him spiraling backward through the air. He falls rapidly. With just a single strike, the great hero is utterly defeated. Jirjiamaishi, crashing into the ground, lets out a bitter laugh, realizing he could only graze the giant's skin. As he coughs up blood, we can't help but admire this man. Though defeated, he remains a legend. From beginning to end, he showed no fear, even knowing the gap in their power was like heaven and earth. Jirjiamaishi was a complex, powerful man, charismatic, domineering, and incredibly proud. Seeing such a hero reach his end brings a sense of pity, yet his fate is something that cannot be changed. Meanwhile, Randall is also spitting blood, his chest heaving as he stares at the giant without a trace of fear. He had accepted death from the start. A Yanli warrior never fears the end, though the sheer power gap is staggering. We have to wonder what kind of being they were even fighting. Do they regret it now? The giant sighs softly. His massive form, shrouded in golden light, pierces the clouds like an ancient, mysterious deity. Does he regret it? No, it was simply a choice. Giorgiomaishi coughs up more blood, unable to say anything more. At this moment, the Yanli civilization faces total defeat after failing to challenge the beast of wisdom. They know what this means. A world-ending disaster is coming. We see the army collapsing into a panicked, screaming mess. Destruction and extinction loom over them. The soldiers wail in agony, consumed by a primal terror. Cries for help echo everywhere. Help me, they scream. Save us. The desperate pleas for mercy continue to ring out across the battlefield. Help me, they cry, their voices trembling with an overwhelming, suffocating fear. Some begin to laugh hysterically in their despair, clearly driven to the brink of madness. The scene is one of pure insanity. The giant never intended to hold the fate of so many in his hands. To control the rise and fall of a civilization is a heavy burden. He looks down at the fading hero king and speaks. Will we face total destruction? He wonders, just as we destroyed countless races of giant beasts before us? Will you destroy us to avenge them? We watch him in silence as his civilization teeters on the brink of ruin. Yet, even in this final moment, he shows no trace of fear. After a brief pause, the giant considers his words. Since you refuse to listen to my warnings, I will indeed destroy you. You have shattered the world's ecological balance. You have driven too many species to extinction, and I cannot allow you to continue multiplying without end. Giorgiomaishi hears this, and he gives a smile of quiet resignation. Years ago, you told me what civilization truly was. Now, could you answer just a few more questions for me? Our king is actually asking the beast of wisdom to answer his questions. The surrounding crowd holds its breath, looking up at the towering giant as the air falls silent. The great beast remains silent for a time. Then, suddenly, a voice pierces through the vast layers of clouds, descending upon the shattered and defeated royal city below. Speak your questions, the giant commands. In an instant, the world seems to fall into a deathly stillness. On the blood-soaked earth, all sound simply vanishes. Countless fleeing soldiers stop in their tracks, turning back to gaze at the giant in the sky. By what means? Will you destroy us? I will use water, the giant replies calmly after a moment of thought. I shall use a massive flood to wash away and submerge this entire civilization, erasing every footprint you have ever left behind. The earth holds its breath. Everyone is plunged into a chilling silence as they process the fate of their entire civilization. And so, the beast of wisdom intends to use a great deluge to cleanse this land of its sinful inhabitants. But even for a being as powerful as the beast of wisdom, how could he possibly trigger a flood that covers the entire world? This is no longer the mere strength of a beast. This is clearly something else entirely. Their breathing quickens, their faces pale with shock. For a moment, they cannot even find a word to describe this legendary beast of wisdom. Then comes the second question. This world is vast and wide. So why have we never seen your footprints across these lands before? Where do you truly come from? What kind of existence is the beast of wisdom, really? Why did you give us the spark of civilization, only to stop us from slaughtering other races? You claim all living things are equal, the savage beasts, the intelligent races, and even the plants. If they are all the same, then what exactly is this land to you? The giant lowers his head slightly, looking down at this fallen hero king as his vast voice echoes across the city. This land is a world of my own creation, and you are all my subjects. The savage beasts, the intelligent races, and the plants. Every single species is my child in my eyes. Therefore, you are all equal. In that moment, the air freezes, and the people on the ground below begin to breathe in sharp, ragged gasps that grow into a chorus of frantic panting. Giorgiomaishi is struck speechless, his face twisted in a look of utter, stunned disbelief. Then he suddenly begins to laugh, a sound that grows into a wild, arrogant roar. How interesting. This is truly too interesting. What kind of being have we been struggling against all this time? It turns out the legendary beast of wisdom was only a beast in our own imagination. It is no mere creature. He is the almighty master of all things, the creator who brought this entire world into being. Such an existence should be called a god. On this land, the tribal people had never known the concept of a god, but now they do. I was once so arrogant, naming the book that recorded my history of creating civilization Genesis. I believed I had created a civilized world, but the true creator was the beast of wisdom all along. All living things are merely his subjects. What a magnificent and terrifying power that is. To think I actually tried to. And here, the voice of Giorgiomaishi simply cuts off. His laughter rises toward the sky, growing more reckless by the second, while we watch the giant stand in silent contemplation. The massive figure remains at the edge of the royal city, quietly observing this fallen hero king's final moments. Being naturally patient, the giant tolerates this final burst of defiance before Giorgiomaishi asks one last question. How many days did it take you to create our world? The question causes the giant to pause in deep thought. He recalls the effort of transforming his orchard into this sandbox, hauling soil and shaping the terrain. Between moving the earth and molding the mountains, preparing this square plot of land had taken quite a bit of work. It took exactly 1 week to complete. And so, he answers honestly, I created this land in 7 days. Jiraiya is stunned, then collapses into hysterical laughter, tears streaming down his face as he loses all control. In that instant, something inside him shatters, the sound of a heart breaking as his pride and arrogance are crushed. There is no greater sorrow than the death of the heart. 7 days, he repeats, as his vision of the world fades. In a daze, he remembers standing on that giant palm as a child, asking his very first question, what is civilization? Civilization is a living seed, it is knowledge, and it is order. It is the greatest strength born of wisdom. His laughter grows louder, echoing across the winds, the hills, the rivers, and the deep forests of the land. Every living soul across the territory looks up in a trance, as if hearing the final, tragic song of their ruler. Countless people begin to weep, singing an unknown elegy for the king of Yanli, a mournful song for a fading life. On this day, at the edge of the historic royal city, the era of a great epic hero king comes to a close. Jiraiya reaches the end of his life, becoming mere dust in the long halls of history as the giant sighs. We watch as the giant sees the hero king off. He never intended to fight for anything or withhold any secrets. Every question was answered truthfully, yet the giant simply did not possess the power to grant him eternal life. The giant himself is facing his own end, making this struggle seem all the more tragic. The king is dead. Our king, the strongest hero in history, Jiraiya, dared to swing his sword at the creator himself. He is dead, and we are defeated. Countless people are wailing in despair, fleeing in a state of absolute madness. We see the giant looking down silently at the chaos, where the cries of the people seem to echo across the entire land. Every soul is in a trance, and the air itself seems to carry the heavy realization, the king is dead, and we have lost. As the masses scream and scatter in terror, the giant simply watches the scene unfold from his great height. But where can these people possibly run? To the very edge of the world? It is a truly incredible sight. Standing atop the high walls of the royal city, a humble historian watches the great hero king collapse and die. Drenched in cold sweat after learning the terrifying truth, he realizes he must record everything before his own end comes. He must leave the truth of this world for future generations. To be honest, his entire body is trembling with the weight of it. Sweat soaks his arms as he finishes the account of Jiraiya's defiant challenge against the great beast of wisdom. With shaking hands, he turns to a fresh page to begin a new chapter, one he titles Genesis. The chronicles of the Yanli kingdom record that the beast was the creator and that Jiraiya grew arrogant in his old age. He attempted to strike the Lord, seeking eternal life through divine blood, and in doing so, he finally moved the heavens to anger. The gods judged the people's sins as unforgivable and resolved to destroy the Yanli civilization with a great, cleansing flood. The sky vibrates and the earth groans. Within the royal city, an atmosphere of suffocating anxiety takes hold of the people. Panic boils over as they realize the divine will crush their spirits and break their very backs in judgment. The great flood is coming to erase their world and their civilization. And it is at this exact moment that things take a turn. A young man with golden hair, carrying a mysterious bundle, arrives at the feet of the silent giant. He opens the package to reveal a severed head and shouts, "Great beast of wisdom, I have come to seek atonement." The giant is momentarily stunned. Of the 3 kings, it seems only 2 have made their final appearance. The forest king has yet to arrive, choosing instead to kneel and plead, pressing himself firmly against the ground. We see that our Yanli people are not merely savages. Even the great teacher Likadu has already proven this through his own sacrifice. He preferred to defy a royal decree rather than swing a sword at the benefactor who gave us civilization. We are not entirely consumed by evil. Even as the divine punishment descends, it seems the Yanli people might be left with one final thread of hope. Upon hearing the forest king's plea, the giant lets out a heavy sigh. In truth, he never expected Jiraiya to be so utterly mad, nor did he ever truly intend to exterminate them all. It was simply that they had become too presumptuous. Such reckless defiance and senseless brutality must eventually be paid for. He commands the man to use the wood of the great divine tree to construct an ark. He must take at least 1 pair of every living seed on earth and use the remaining space for the people of the Likadu forest. Once those of good will have boarded, the great flood will descend to cleanse the world. With that, the giant turns to leave. The air around him vibrates with voices of shock and excitement. They were defeated, yes, but their entire race would not be wiped out. A spark of hope remains, and they offer thanks for the Creator's mercy, all thanks to the intervention of the Forest King. Likadu has shown the Lord that there is still kindness within them. They are not savages, and they are still worthy of redemption. They tell themselves they are not beyond saving. Praise Likadu, they cry. Praise the great king of the forest. The historian, weeping with joy, watches the giants retreating back and begins to write with renewed fervor. In the Yanli Kingdom chapter of Genesis, it is recorded that the benevolence of Forest King Likadu moved the heavens to stay their hand, leaving a chance for survival for the people who had dared to defy God. The command was given to build the ark and escape the world-ending flood. Meanwhile, we return to the courtyard. He tidies up and finds a high-pressure water gun in the corner of the farm, one that Suchin had bought while shopping recently. He hadn't expected it to come in handy so soon. In the 10 minutes it takes him to prepare the water gun. Inside the sandbox, a full 120 days have already flashed by, with countless people appearing as nothing more than blurred shadows. They have cut down the divine bonsai tree left behind years ago to build a massive ark, gathering the seeds of every living thing. The young of various giant beasts and the species of the entire world are now condensed within this single, enormous vessel. Fortunately, the area isn't too large for the cleaning to begin. He steps toward the sandbox, ready to initiate the purification. From a dozen meters away, he raises the high-pressure water gun and begins a steady sweep, unleashing a snow-white torrent of water. As the spray hits the city-state civilization in the orchard, great trees topple and the massive city collapses in an instant. Countless beasts flee the forest, desperately trying to outrun the towering white flood, only to be swallowed by the depths. The world seems to change color in a heartbeat. Amidst the vast whiteness, Likadu leads his people onto the ark. They look at the sky in sheer shock. It is a terrifyingly powerful sight, as if the very heavens themselves have opened up. The windows of heaven are thrown wide, and endless white currents surge down from the clouds, washing over the entire land. Except for the ark, which remains floating upon the waters, the entire world has been submerged in a vast, white expanse. Amidst the white spray, the great flood pours down like a pale waterfall from the very peak of the firmament. The rushing waters drown the mountains and rivers. What terrifying power it is to bring such destruction in a mere moment. The great flood that destroys the world has descended. On the deck, merchants, nobles, and commoners alike stand frozen. Civilians and slaves sigh in collective awe and terror. This day would forever be remembered by those left behind. The great flood that ends the world is known as the Day of Disaster, the final afterglow of the Yanli civilization. The remaining Yanli people board the last ark to escape the deluge. In a deserted corner of the ship, a lone figure watches. The historian, Baymin, sits huddled on the deck with his quill, still utterly immersed in the memory of that divine, miraculous figure. Their world was created by God in just 7 days. Such is the staggering, dark majesty of the power they witnessed. With trembling hands and eyes clouded by tears, Baymin begins to silently record his own vision of those 7 days of creation. He lifts his pen to write the book of Genesis, recording the final account of God's 7 days of creation. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light." And so, there was light. God divided the light from the darkness, calling the light mantra and the darkness night. On the second day, God once again separated the light and the dark, defining the boundaries of the day and the shadows. On that same second day, God said, "Let there be air to separate the waters," and thus the angel's staff appeared. Then came the third day. God commanded the waters under the heavens to be gathered into one place, so the dry land would appear, and the water and land were parted. He separated the light from the dark, calling the light mantra and the darkness night, as the work of the second day concluded. On the third day, God spoke again, ordering the waters of the world to gather so that the dry land might be revealed to all. The water and land were separated. God called the land the continent and the gathered waters the ocean. Then came the fourth day. The fifth day passed, then the sixth, and by the seventh day, the heavens, the earth, and all living things within them were complete. God rested, and on this day he blessed the previous 6. In the days that followed, people took this grand, observed vision, and they accepted it as absolute truth, as if the Creator himself had truly stood before mortals to detail his 7 days of labor. But would a god really lower himself to explain the mechanics of creation to humble subjects? To be honest, people simply preferred the story. In this tale, God rested on the 7th day, and so the people named this day the Day of Rest, or the Holy Day. Thus, a custom was born across the land, and the people chose to set aside their work and rest on this day as well. We see him spray the area for a long while, and only after ensuring nothing was missed does he finally stop the high-pressure gun and flip the switch. He returns the tools to the storage room. Just like that, the board is cleared, like turning over an endless hourglass to start anew. Overpopulation had nearly broken the sandbox, but now, with a single pair of each species remaining, the ecosystem will eventually recover. He hopes that after this, they will be more cautious. Nearby, the creator brain remarks that even without this destruction, they would have eventually destroyed themselves, consuming every species until they perished. It is better to welcome this new life early. He lets out a long, heavy sigh. He isn't as fragile as one might think and needs no comfort, though his heart remains heavy. The creator brain speaks, telling him that he doesn't need comfort, though it acknowledges his heart must be heavy. As the empress of the Chongqiao, having birthed countless people and races, the brain tells him he is a great creator and should be used to this. It speaks of the rise and fall of endless civilizations, but the veins on Xiao Zheng's forehead begin to throb with annoyance. He reminds the brain that he is a man, not an empress, but the machine insists they are all his offspring. It claims the reputation of the restoration plan is what matters most, but he quickly cuts the brain off. He sits on a chair by the courtyard gate, quietly eating a piece of peeled fruit, planning to buy more in town tomorrow. He tells himself he needs to treat his stomach better, and after a long time, he picks up his black notebook to record the era of giants. He originally wanted to call this the Beast Era to match Earth's Cretaceous, but since the locals recorded it as Genesis, he decides to follow suit. On Earth, the Cretaceous ended with a meteor destroying the dinosaurs. Here, it was a flood from the heavens. The flood destroyed the giants, and the restoration began. In his history of evolution, he labels this the Genesis mass extinction. After the records of the Dark Martial, Sea Martial, and New Life eras, he turns to the fourth page and writes, Genesis. The plan details the rise of intelligent beings and the development of tribal city-states to drive out the giants. The next morning, as he brushes his teeth, he feels a terrifying, boiling power spreading through his entire body, prompting him to immediately begin studying his own physical structure. Looking in the mirror, he notices his height has changed again, leaving him with an incredible sensation as he gathers his thoughts. We see him return to his notes, following the Dark Martial, Sea Martial, and New Life eras to finalize the fourth plan, Genesis. The goal is for intelligent life to develop tribal civilizations and drive out the giants, eventually becoming the overlords of this world. Yet, he notes that they are also becoming increasingly cruel and violent. He has grown several centimeters out of thin air, reaching 183 centimeters, his face becoming more refined and handsome. His physique is now lean and muscular, like a Greek sculpture, perfectly toned. This is the result of the third mass extinction. The power fed back to him is countless times stronger than the previous 2 times. He is now comparable to a top-tier athlete. Xiao Zheng clenches his fists, feeling a sudden burst of explosive power, though his new proportions make him look like a perfect Nordic god. Instead of being pleased, he feels a headache coming on, wondering how on earth Su Qin will react to such a drastic change. She'll surely accuse him of using a heavy filter on his photos. He fears he'll be sent to a lab for study unless he can modify his genes. He suddenly asks the creator brain if it's possible to revert these conspicuous, perfect genes back to his original appearance. This look is simply too exaggerated, the kind that makes people scream in the street. And to be honest, his previous face was perfectly fine. It was already difficult enough to get Su Qin and his neighbors in the village to accept his recent changes. If he keeps transforming like this, they will surely become suspicious. Fortunately, as the master, he has the natural ability to edit himself. The brain asks if he wishes to integrate Zerg cells. He is already a Zerg hero, but his body was previously too weak to handle the process. Now that his physique is strong enough, he can finally accept the Zerg cells. He doesn't spend much time debating whether to remain human. After all, his life was already on the line. Now that he is physically powerful, he is ready for the next step. He can finally accept the Zerg cells, and as we see, he doesn't hesitate long on the choice of his own humanity. Faced with a slow death from cancer, being a normal human lost its charm. Being a Zerg seemed much more interesting, really. And so, he gives the word. Immediately, his entire body is drenched in a thick, cold sweat as the transformation begins. He collapses onto the bed, howling in agony before losing consciousness. When he finally comes to, 3 hours have already passed. Covered in a layer of dark, gray grime, he hurries to take a shower and change his clothes before inspecting his new self. His body feels entirely different now, filled with limitless potential. He has become, in every sense, a true Zerg. With Zerg cells and the talent for accelerated division, he can now regulate his genes at will. He slowly closes his eyes to look within. In the darkness of his mind, he sees a twisted double helix of DNA. Within these elite human strands, vast amounts of useless, junk data have been cleared and optimized, leaving only the essence. Most of the chain now sits blank and ready. But when he attempts to finally remove the cancer cells, the creator brain delivers a cold reply. They are now a fundamental part of his genetic makeup. The news that they cannot be removed hits him hard. Since he can't excise the human genes, he must find a way to heal them instead. Furthermore, the creator brain reveals a terrifying truth. Cancer cells are the body's own rebels, and the stronger a person becomes, the stronger those cancer cells grow. In other words, as he gains power, the cancer within him gains strength as well. They are breeding wildly inside him. If he absorbs any more power from this mass extinction, he might simply drop dead on the spot. He is understandably startled by this realization. For the time being, he cannot accept any more feedback from a fourth mass extinction. He takes a deep breath, telling himself to remain vigilant. This means that for a short while, he must be extremely cautious. Even if the creatures on this land act out or become violent, he cannot simply wipe them out at will. He must stay on guard. To put it simply, he can no longer afford to trigger a mass extinction to solve his problems, no matter how much they misbehave. The deck has been reshuffled. He recalls the frantic arguments and the desperation of the species he watched perish the night before. That sight filled him with a renewed terror and awe of death, especially now that his cancer has progressed from mid-stage to terminal. Death is the ultimate fear for any living being, and he wonders if he can truly survive this. He stands and walks toward the yard. With terminal cancer, the clock is ticking loudly. He knows he must act quickly in the coming era to find a solution. He needs to simulate racial civilizations and extraordinary powers within the Great Sandbox, hoping to find a way to modify his biology. He searches for a power capable of fighting off the cancer cells. Looking at the sandbox now, he sees a world where everything has withered. There is almost no sign of life. A single night is equivalent to 50 years in the sandbox, yet the world hasn't fully recovered its breath. With only a few pairs of each species left to slowly reproduce, they have finally begun to obey the gods' warning that all life is equal. They have reduced unnecessary killing, taking only what they need for food, and some even help other species expand their populations. At the same time, strange and diverse new species are beginning to emerge from the ruins of the Great Extinction. It's quite a sight, really. It looks like a new world sprouting from the ashes of the old. Things have stabilized, and the cycle of development is starting anew. But it is still too slow, and he doesn't have much time left. He sighs, wondering if he should open a second sandbox to start a new Genesis. He considers the possibility of opening an entirely new world sandbox to accelerate the process of evolution. He realizes his own ideas might be limited, so he shifts his thinking. After all, true wisdom is often unpredictable. Evolution often births things that defy logic, and he decides that perhaps he should borrow the wisdom of others. Working in isolation has become too restrictive for his goals. No matter how he looks at it, he needs a change. It is far better to gather a collective intelligence than to struggle alone. He needs a way to brainstorm on a massive scale. He decides to bring a group of people into his project. Yes, he is ready to take a big gamble this time. Instead of evolving species slowly by himself, he will let others help him simulate the evolution of basic spores. He thinks back to spore-based games where players evolve into complex beings, wondering if he can turn a mini sandbox into an online game. By allowing others to enter through special equipment, they could treat the sandbox as a game and evolve new species for him. With the technology at his disposal, such a feat was certainly possible, though upgrading the sand monsters remained out of reach. He nodded, acknowledging the limitation. He reminds himself that this isn't just a game, it's a real world. He plans to create an open-world sandbox, similar to Minecraft. He will grant players 10,000 times accelerated cell division, letting them start as simple spores to evolve their own species. The players will control every aspect: cell division, growth, evolution, and even the eventual death of their creations. A full cycle of evolution could be completed in just 2 or 3 days, a clever little design born from a sudden whim. He won't spend too much energy on this side project, as his main focus remains the Great Sandbox. To be honest, it's a brilliant shortcut. From each game session, he will select the most unique and promising races to integrate into the Great Sandbox world. Having only the Chongyuan as an intelligent race is far too limited, and we know that a single dominant species can be dangerous. He learns it will take about 3 days to set up, using existing VR glasses as the medium for the players. Outside his front door, he clears a small 30-square-meter area for the mini sandbox and begins to work the soil. Following his previous layout with practiced ease, he recreates the environment, feeling his strength returning as he works. Although the terminal illness still lingered in his body, he felt a newfound strength as he finished the sandbox environment a day later. His physical condition was improving. Despite the illness, he had the energy to work, and within a single day, the foundation was set. Meanwhile, we meet Chen Wenshan, a veteran gamer on the Steam platform who was busy hunting for niche new titles to play. He stumbled upon a VR beta called Spore Evolution, which was described simply as a sandbox farming and survival game. The pitch was simple: start as a single spore with infinite evolutionary possibilities, the ultimate choice for dedicated players. At first, he scoffed, assuming it was just another local developer using a gimmick, but the massive 73-gigabyte file size caught his eye. Driven by curiosity, he downloaded the game, put on his VR headset, and entered a world that seemed impossible to believe. He could actually feel his limbs, or rather, the sensation of swimming through a real ocean, leaving Wenshan's mind completely blank with shock. He felt as though he had touched something beyond imagination, though at first, he couldn't see a single thing in the game. This was because he was still in a spore state, a single-celled organism that needed to evolve eyes and a visual system first. He died countless times, breeding generation after generation, until he finally evolved eyes and, eventually, a mouth. He began to hunt, but his lineage went extinct quickly. His eyes were too weak, and he was constantly ambushed by unseen enemies. Determined, he even went to the library to research biological evolution, and half a day later, he finally managed to evolve a new form. It was a creature that could barely survive, a mass of sensory tentacles surrounding one massive, venomous eye. Beneath it sat a small mouth filled with sharp teeth. Deep down, he felt a surge of pride, knowing he had finally succeeded. Filled with a sense of achievement, Wenshan controlled his tentacle monster as it crawled on ashore, stunned by the realistic scenery. We return to our protagonist, who was sitting by his front door eating an apple in the sun when he spotted this bizarre creature. He was momentarily stunned by the sight. It was a truly freakish evolution, with an eye so large it took up 2/3 of its body. One has to wonder just how much resentment the player felt about being blind to evolve such a massive eyeball. According to the laws of evolution, wasting most of one's nutrients on a uselessly large eye would surely lead to natural extinction. And yet, our protagonist found the creature quite interesting. Its bizarre shape looked remarkably like the mythical monster, Xia. Just then, a knocking sound came from the door as Su Qin arrived with food. He stood up to greet her, accidentally stepping right on the blood-eyed monster. With a wet crunch, the creature was reduced to a pulp, and back in his room, Chun Wenshan saw the evolution failed screen once again. Wenshan was left completely stunned. He had evolved so carefully into a decent species and had just crawled ashore to conquer the world. How could he have been crushed to death so suddenly? Meanwhile, our protagonist opened the door to find Su Qin with another delicious meal. She glanced into the yard and asked why he seemed so happy farming all by himself. He simply replied that it was going well. He told her that farming brought him joy, but she just stared at him, looking quite shocked by his demeanor. She wondered why his aura felt so different, noting he had become quite elegant and jokingly asking if he had used some kind of cheat code. Though he had reverted his physical appearance, having overseen 3 mass extinctions gave him a transcendent aura that was hard to hide. He simply touched her forehead and asked if she was sick. After being thoroughly teased, she had no choice but to change the subject. She asked if he ever got bored in the yard and suggested they go shopping together, which caught him off guard. He asked if she was serious and where her boyfriend was, only to learn they had broken up after he got sick and quit his job. She lamented that at his peak, he was hit with a terminal illness, lost his job, and was abandoned by his girlfriend. To her, it seemed he had only returned to the countryside to spend his final days in lonely misery, a truly pitiful situation. She offered to be his girlfriend before he passed away, claiming it would fulfill a childhood wish of hers. She mentioned her experience as a volunteer caring for terminal patients, promising to cook for him and keep him company. She wanted his final days to be happy, but the phrase final days left our protagonist momentarily speechless. He looked at her with a faint, playful smile and asked if she was serious about fulfilling all the duties of a girlfriend. Su Qin shivered, stepping back and clutching her clothes, insisting this was a pure romance and accusing him of wanting to ruin her virtue while dying. She suggested they be surface-level lovers, and to be honest, he appreciated her bluntness and agreed. She mentioned a high school reunion coming up in a few days and insisted he accompany her, noting that his good looks would be a great asset. Taking him along would certainly make her look good and make her friends jealous, so she dragged him along to pick out clothes since he was free anyway. Since they still had some time to kill, she suggested they go on a little spending spree, and in that moment, their eyes met with a silent understanding. Our protagonist realized he had fallen right into a trap. It seemed this girl only sought him out because she needed someone to pay for clothes and act as a trophy boyfriend. Still, gaining a surface-level girlfriend meant having a personal little helper, even if her enthusiasm usually only lasted about 3 minutes. Since she was willing to prepare meticulous meals every day, it meant he wouldn't have to travel into the county just to find something to eat anymore. He knew he had to watch his diet, as outside food was often unreliable, but soon we returned to his work where he began studying that blood-eyed creature again. Although he had accidentally crushed one, the species still existed in the small sandbox, though they were now on the verge of extinction. With 2/3 of their body mass being nothing but an eyeball, they were practically destined to be weeded out by natural selection. He wondered if they had the potential to become a transcendent species, despite their simple, violent, and inherently wicked minds. Because of those massive eyes, their initial mental power was actually quite formidable, yet they would surely vanish if left entirely to their own devices. Perhaps they were like a cocooned larvae, weak in the beginning, but capable of something much greater if given the chance to grow. And so, he decided to introduce this species into the large sandbox to see what they could truly become. Our protagonist began carving out a dedicated swamp area within the vast expanse of the White Mother sandbox. He used cornerstone manure to create a fertile, rotting mire, knowing that microbial fermentation would eventually generate natural biogas. Once it had transformed into a perfectly sticky, muddy bog, he placed the blood-eyed creatures directly into their new home to survive. In this isolated place, there was no competition, allowing even the weakest creatures to multiply in peace, which, to be honest, was a rare luxury. Whether they could eventually become the world's first transcendent monsters was now entirely up to them. While back in the small sandbox, our first player, Chun Wenshan, posted a detailed review on the forums, emphasizing that the game featured a 100% realistic sense of touch. He warned others that you feel exactly what your evolved creature feels, and since death means starting over, there are no shortcuts to success. He even went as far as to write at the end of his review that his ultimate goal was to evolve into a legendary dragon. His plan? To fly over the head of the giant peeling apples in the yard and leave a little gift. Yes, he actually planned to do that to our protagonist. One has to wonder if he knew what happened to the last species that dared to provoke the creator in such a way. Our protagonist silently made a mental note of the debt. Meanwhile, in just one day, the 100 spots for the small sandbox were completely filled. Online, thousands of people were clamoring for more beta testing slots, complaining that the current number was far too small. But as far as he was concerned, it wasn't his problem. He wasn't making money from this game, so they could complain all they liked. He was too lazy to expand it, as it was just a small project, and no amount of public outcry would change his mind unless a true surprise occurred. Otherwise, it would stay in beta forever while he shifted his focus back to the large sandbox, his real work. Strictly speaking, the previous era of the Salt people had only produced 3 transcendent beings, including the likes of Gilgamesh. For the next civilization, he hoped to see the emergence of a fully mature and sophisticated system of cultivation. Ideally, he wanted to see a wizard civilization evolve. After all, we remember that Gilgamesh had previously explored this path. He had once commissioned court dark wizards to research longevity potions, which served as the very first prototype of wizardry. Our protagonist hoped for the rise of a great wizard, one skilled in metallurgy and the brewing of complex potions. Perhaps they could even create something to cure cancer. But to build a complete transcendent system, the world needed more. The sandbox required various mysterious and dangerous species to serve as research material for these future wizards. We see him look toward the swampy mire in the large sandbox. A day had passed, and the blood-eyed creatures had multiplied significantly. They had even begun to evolve unique individuals. He realized with a start that over 100 years had already passed inside. Without any natural predators, the blood-eyed creatures had bred uncontrollably, but the resulting overpopulation soon created intense internal pressure. With food becoming scarce, they began to turn on one another, preying on their own kind as the environment grew increasingly hostile. And then, a truly unique blood-eyed creature emerged, possessing a strange and formidable mental power. Any creature caught in its gaze would be instantly charmed, walking submissively toward it to become its next meal. This first transcendent blood-salt creature quickly claimed the land, becoming the absolute overlord of the swamp ecosystem without any natural predators. It bred at a frantic pace, and through a brutal process of natural selection, the ordinary blood-salt creatures were soon slaughtered in mass. The entire swamp was now filled with its descendants, all possessing that same charming ability. A transcendent species had finally emerged with chaotic mental power. Our protagonist felt a slight jolt of excitement. It had taken until the 4th era for the very first transcendent species to finally be born. Just then, we see him look back at the large sandbox, where another dramatic event was unfolding as a group of survivors appeared. They had ventured into that treacherous swampy mire. Over 200 years had passed since the Great Flood, spanning several generations of the Yamli tribe. Clad in animal skins, they no longer needed thick natural hair for warmth, so their black body hair had thinned and their outer shells vanished. Their bodies began to stand tall and straight, revealing pale, fair skin as they evolved further away from their primitive ancestors. They had transitioned from hairy primates to a subhuman race, their physical forms increasingly resembling the rugged and strong builds of Western humans. They once possessed a glorious city-state civilization, but now they remained stuck as simple farming tribes. All their past glory had been built on one man. Everything had rested on the shoulders of the hero king, Gilgamesh, but without their king, they found themselves with absolutely nothing. Unable to develop into the Iron Age and relying only on crude stone spears, they struggled to fight giant beasts. Even their holy sword was gone. The Sword of Ruin had followed Gilgamesh, sinking forever into the endless deep sea of the Great Flood, and in this moment, Muge, the daughter of the Babylon tribe chief, sighed as she looked at the horizon, remembering that era as a magnificent, one-man epic. The great hero king, Gilgamesh, it was no wonder the people of that time were willing to give up everything just to follow him. However, she knew deep down that his return was impossible, no matter how much they wished for it. To be honest, the weight of that lost history was a heavy burden for her people to carry alone. Their era had fallen into a state of decline. She lamented that if the God-given sword of civilization hadn't been lost, even without the power of the blood of strength, they might not have ended up in such a desperate situation. Life had become a constant struggle, and Muge found herself wondering if civilization was meant to be the shield that protected the power of their wisdom. She pondered the path forward for their people and how they were meant to survive. We see that Muge remained calm, being the most capable in the tribe. Though her raw strength didn't match the men's, her superior killing techniques allowed her to defeat most of the warriors in the tribe. She turned to the lean, strong men beside her and asked for a report on the area they were currently scouting. She wanted to know exactly how the exploration of this new region was proceeding and what they had discovered so far. One of the warriors replied, explaining that the land ahead was nothing but a vast, treacherous mire. It was an immense, muddy swamp, likely formed by the receding waters and sediment left behind after the Great Flood. The area was teeming with life and filled with delicious fruits. This was, in fact, the fertile wetland our protagonist had cultivated using his own methods. Naturally, the vegetation here was more lush than anywhere else. Muge took a deep breath as she surveyed the vast, dark bog before them. Just as she was about to designate this place as the tribe's next gathering point, she suddenly sensed that something was very wrong. Wait, she realized 2 people were missing, and as the others looked at one another in confusion, a heavy silence fell over the group. Muge made a split-second decision to retreat with the remaining 20 men, but at that exact moment, something emerged from the mud. A repulsive, grayish-black crown of tentacles rose up, its appendages swaying like rotting seaweed around a central core. At the center sat a massive, bloodshot crimson eye that took up 2/3 of its body, and yet, strangely, the men found it beautiful. The warriors suddenly froze, staring into that wicked, blood-streaked eye as if they were looking at the most beautiful woman in the world. Overwhelmed by a sudden, frantic obsession, they ignored all attempts to stop them and began walking toward the creature in a trance. It seemed those eerie, giant eyeballs could actually charm their prey into approaching voluntarily. The two missing men had surely met the same fate. Realizing they were walking straight into a trap, she acted instantly, striking those who were charmed to snap them out of it. She led the group in a hasty retreat, but then, she suddenly stopped in her tracks, her eyes burning with a newfound intensity. She marveled at what a wondrous creature it was, physically weaker than them, possessing nothing but soft, powerless tentacles. That foolish, giant eyeball possessed a terrifying and mysterious power, one capable of destroying a person's very will. Deep down, she realized that despite their influence, these creatures were actually far weaker than her own people. They had nothing but powerless, soft tentacles and that absurdly large eye, yet they held such an incredible, frightening strength. It could ruin creatures much stronger than itself. We see her begin to wonder why they were the only ones with such gifts. She questioned why only these monsters possessed such a unique power, and a strange light began to flicker in Muge's eyes. It was as if an unnamed torch was burning within her, and a terrifying new ambition began to wake in her heart. She decided she would seize that power for herself, commanding the tribe to kill the beast before they made their escape. The warriors were stunned as she suddenly turned back, raising her white stone spear high as a stray beam of light fell from above. The glow illuminated her cold, beautiful face, making her look like a goddess of war stepped straight out of a legend. She ordered them to follow her and kill it, intent on bringing its corpse back to the tribe. But then, the situation shifted. One of the men let out a roar of warning, pointing toward the depths of the black marsh where more of them were approaching. More of the giant-eyed tentacle monsters were writhing through the muck, crawling slowly, at a pace that was almost laughable, really. However, their eerie power was dangerous in the extreme. If they were surrounded by those staring eyes, all would be lost. Even if it cost her life, she was determined to kill at least one. Muge gripped her spear, becoming the tribe's fiercest warrior. Transforming into a whirlwind of aggression, she charged forward alone and struck with a single, decisive thrust of her spear. Accompanied by a sharp, raspy scream that sounded like a crying infant, the fragile eyeball exploded in a spray of gore. But in that moment, she suddenly paused, her gaze burning with an even more intense heat as she marveled at the creature. She saw clearly now that they were physically much weaker than humans, possessing only those soft, useless tentacles. Yet they held a terrifying, incredible power that allowed them to destroy beings far more powerful than themselves. She asked herself if her people weren't just as small, and why they hadn't been granted such a unique strength of their own. Within Muge's eyes, it was as if an unnamed torch was burning, fueling a terrifying new thought. An ambition awoke in her heart. She would seize this power for herself, commanding the tribe to kill it. We see the warriors freeze in shock as she suddenly turns, raising her white stone spear high. A stray beam of light falls from the sky, illuminating her cold and strikingly beautiful face. Looking like a goddess of war from ancient legend, she orders them to kill it and take the corpse. But the situation shifts as someone roars a warning, pointing toward the depths of the black marsh. More of those giant-eyed tentacle monsters are writhing through the muck, crawling slowly toward them. Their movements were almost laughably slow, yet their eerie power was dangerous in the extreme if they were surrounded. Even if it cost her life, she was determined to kill one. Muge gripped her stone spear tightly. Transforming into the tribe's fiercest warrior, she charges forward alone and strikes with a single, decisive thrust. Accompanied by a sharp, raspy scream like a crying infant, the creature's fragile eyeball suddenly explodes. The stench is overwhelming as foul fluids spray across Muge's face, but she refuses to back down. She grabs the corpse's tentacles to drag it away, only to find they are already surrounded by 8 more eyes. Her face turns pale as she screams for them to fight their way out, beginning a brutal, bloody slaughter. Nearly the entire hunting party of 30 is wiped out. They could have escaped, but her delay cost them everything. In the end, only 3 survivors managed to flee that demon marsh, a place seemingly cursed by death itself. They were all gone. Even Muge, a woman of incredible strength, cannot help but break down in tears. Over the years, most of the brave men had died hunting beasts, leaving only 100 strong males in the tribe. Now, having lost another third of their strength, the tribe is staring directly into the face of extinction. And yet, she tells herself their race is doomed anyway, so why not risk everything on one final gamble? Muge takes a deep, shaky breath as she looks down at the corpse of the blood-eyed creature. She could only hope that this single specimen, bought at such a terrible cost, would be worth it. She prayed its wicked blood would be useful. After all, countless people had tried to fuse with beast blood over the years. They all shared the same dream, to possess the legendary strength of the hero king, Jirjiamaishi. Perhaps the blood of these strange, specialized creatures could become a new source of power for their people. When Muge finally returns to the tribe with the few survivors, her father is already on the verge of a breakdown. The middle-aged man, clad in black animal skins, gasps for air from his high vantage point, asking if she has lost her mind. He stands there trembling in his dark furs, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he stares at the carnage. She tells him she isn't crazy, they have no retreat left, and fighting to the death is better than waiting for it. Her goal is to see a second Jirjiamaishi rise, someone to lead their civilization back toward a path of glory. She believes this is their only path to survival, but her father insists such a thing is simply impossible. The chief slowly shakes his head, reminding her that only the God-given blood of power from legends can grant true strength. He argues that even if they succeeded in taking power from such a disgusting monster, the gods would surely punish them. Muge counters that power itself has no moral alignment. Even those with the most radiant, noble blood can fall. A person could become a tyrant, she argues, wielding the holy sword of civilization to challenge the almighty God himself. Conversely, she believes that those who possess a dark power might still protect the people, provided their hearts remain kind. These monsters were physically weaker than the tribesmen, yet they possessed a strength that defied all logic. If they could only harness that same power, the chief falls silent, his chest heaving as he considers her words. This decision was weightier than death itself. He looks down at his stubborn daughter, his voice thick with emotion. He points out the grim reality. They no longer have enough people left to test these theories, despite generations of brave leaders. For generations, young men have tried to fuse with the blood of giant beasts, only to die in droves, leaving their population decimated. Muge takes a deep breath, acknowledging the grim truth that they no longer have enough able-bodied men left to spare. However, they have plenty of the elderly and children. For years, it has always been the men who protected the women. She declares that this time, it is the women's turn to step forward, and she adds a chilling, practical calculation. If a large number of the women die, she reasons, the tribe will have fewer burdens to carry in their struggle for survival. She proposes that the women of the tribe face this sacrifice. The tent falls into a deathly silence, lasting for half a day. Later, beneath the glow of massive torches burning on the high ground, we see Muge gathering the entire population together. She tells them that if they wish to avoid extinction and restore the ancient glory of their people, they must act now. If they ever hope to see the rise of a great new hero king, they cannot afford to let fear hold them back. Death itself cannot crush their spirit, she argues, invoking the memory of their greatest legendary leader. Jirjiamaishi once said that the history of humanity's struggle against nature is a testament to their endurance. It is a history of courage and hymns of praise, and today, we find ourselves at another such turning point. She proclaims that history will record their bravery this day, and by tomorrow morning, everything will change. She asks them to come forward for the sake of the tribe, reminding them that the true anthem of humanity is one of courage. Below her, the women hold their children in a heavy, suffocating silence, processing the weight of her words. Everyone understands there is virtually no chance of survival. That night, countless women say their final goodbyes to their families. After the tears are spent, they resolutely choose to undergo the test. Over many long years, they have watched their husbands perish. Their fathers are gone, and they know their sons will likely die in the future too, leaving them with nothing but themselves. With no one left to protect them, they realize they must become their own guardians on a day destined to be stained with blood. Hundreds of women bravely step out to attempt the fusion with the Blood II Corps, leaving over 400 corpses scattered across the field. The ground was covered in the agonizing remains of those who failed, but in the end, 3 women miraculously survived. Muge, along with 2 others named Sushi and Shuangying, would find their names etched into history forever. These 3 survivors, Muge, Sushi, and Shuangying, became the living pillars of their people's future. On the ancient stone walls of the Babylonian murals, amidst a sea of blood and pain, these 3 strong women stand out. Bathed in blood and standing atop the fallen, they gathered together to raise a massive, roaring torch high into the air. Future generations would come to call this sacred ancient mural the 3 witches in honor of their sacrifice. They had successfully taken up the torch of civilization, and in the days that followed, these 3 resolute women led the tribe forward. They began to manifest a strange and potent spiritual power, sharp, powerful, and deeply intuitive. It was a mysterious, almost sinister force, much like the Blood Eye itself, granting them the ability to finally resist the giant beasts. They used their minds to interfere with the monsters from the rear, allowing the warriors of the 10 palaces to fight on the front lines. However, this immense spiritual power was difficult to control, often fluctuating wildly during moments of emotional intensity. Even a moment of intimacy with a man could accidentally crush his mind, leaving them as pure maidens who could never truly be with anyone. They lived lives of lonely pride, feared by all, though Muge herself remained driven by a fierce sense of honor and mission. Leaning on her wooden staff, she led the tribe into war against the beasts, while Shuangying, being more gentle, took a different path. Shuangying preferred leading the women in herding and growing medicinal herbs to heal the people, but Sushi was a different story entirely. Sushi had once been a wife, but she had accidentally killed her husband during a moment of closeness, yet her desires remained insatiable. She began to use her mental powers to charm the men of the tribe in secret, indulging in passions that frequently ended in their deaths. Mysterious deaths among the men began to plague the tribe, and while the people cursed Sushi in whispers, she only grew more resentful. She used her spiritual strength to curse any man who dared to resist her will, exerting a terrifying control over them. The men suffered from splitting headaches and blackened eyes, as the witch Sushi slowly became a shadow over the tribe. She became a synonym for evil and terror, and though the other two tried to stop her, they couldn't bring themselves to kill her. They needed her power. To protect the tribe, they endured Sushi's tyranny, which saw the status of women rise to new heights as the three of them ruled together. They were known as the witches, symbols of immense strength, darkness, and mystery. They were feared and seen as all-powerful, and from that day on, the tribe entered a new era, the Age of the Sorceresses. The records of the Sacred Witch note that the Babylonian tribe suffered greatly, leaving the male population scarce and vulnerable. After the women consumed the Blood Eye's essence, the three great witches emerged, with Muge representing the spirit and glory of war. Then there was Sushi, the witch of curses, ruling over chaos, while the gentle Shuangying mastered the arts of medicine and herding. Witches, indeed. Our observer smiles, having waited silently for over 3 days, which, in their world, translates to quite a long time. Over 300 years had passed, and finally, amidst the lingering shadows of the Great Flood, signs of a true revival began to appear. We see that some had successfully integrated a second gene. They chose the Blood Eye, while others merged with the powerful White Ant gene. This granted them Herculean strength, while the women, known as witches, integrated the Blood Eye gene to unlock their spiritual potential. If the Blood Eye species hadn't appeared in the sandbox as the first extraordinary beings, this path might never have been discovered. The Blood Eye, or the Big Eye monster, turned out to be quite a useful little thing, didn't it? It was a pleasant surprise. Sitting by the courtyard eating an apple, he realized that thinking in isolation is hard. It's better to borrow from others. In reality, the White Ant gene was almost too powerful for its own good. It required a massive amount of blank genetic space, something a normal human could rarely provide on their own. It usually required generations of cooperation, yet Gilgamesh alone could sweep the world. Still, their use of spiritual power remained primitive. Although they were researching witchcraft and herbs, the progress was simply too slow for his liking. He returned to his room to research, looking into Western yoga meditation and the internal visualization techniques of Eastern Taoism. His plan was simple: plant the seeds of meditation within them and let them perfect the path of the witches' cultivation themselves. The beginning of any path is difficult when you're stumbling in the dark, but once a direction is set, progress becomes infinitely faster. But he wondered how he should approach the three witches. Appearing as a giant beast of wisdom again seemed a bit much. He couldn't simply possess the tiny creatures in the sandbox to act as his messengers, and as he sat there pondering, he noticed that in the smaller sandbox, a group of hardcore players had already crawled onto land, where they made a discovery. They saw a vast, unfathomable giant sitting on a chair that reached the heavens, eating an apple with a look of deep contemplation. It was quite amusing, really. In their eyes, he was likely just a massive entity cleaning up the garden's pests. They whispered among themselves, wondering if they were meant to fight this giant, amazed by the game's incredible level of freedom. We see them observing from the shadows, warning each other that they are no match for him and to avoid being stepped on. After all, there would be no one to hear their cries if they were crushed, so the players remained hidden in the coastal woods. Terrified of a stray footfall, the group of players huddled together under the cover of the trees, watching his every move. They pointed and gestured at him, a bunch of eccentrics, really, while he sat there in his courtyard minding his own business. He watched the tiny creatures whispering about him, as if he were some final boss, until he heard the sound of the door opening. Su Qing had arrived with food, so he decided to take a break, but as he stood up, it felt like a massive earthquake to them. To the players, it looked as if the world itself was rising, and they scrambled to flee before they were flattened by his feet. The strange little creatures ran for their lives across the earth as the giant, whose head touched the clouds, began to walk. With a single stride, he crossed 1,000 miles, stepping over them to retrieve a blue lunchbox before returning to his seat. As he enjoyed his meal, he continued to brainstorm how to pass the secrets of meditation to the three Babylonian witches. Meanwhile, the players crept out from the woods again, gathering in a circle to discuss this new development. They assumed the boss was simply stuck in a scripted eating animation, deciding it was the perfect time to level up their stats. He watched the little ants planning how to raid him and felt utterly speechless, until a sudden inspiration finally struck him. He realized he could use the game's evolution sandbox to enter the main world directly by evolving from a simple spore into a V-shaped creature. The excitement was almost too much to handle. It seemed his decision to establish the smaller sandbox earlier had been a stroke of genius. But if he was going to enter the field personally, he first had to clear the area. A second later, an urgent announcement flashed before every player's eyes. The game was undergoing emergency maintenance and would go offline in 3 seconds. The entire sandbox erupted in chaos as players cursed the developers for such a short warning. And then, the 3 seconds were up. Every screen went black simultaneously. Across the world, countless people pulled off their VR headsets in total confusion. Some nearly smashed their equipment, completely unaware that it was their own reckless chatter in front of him that had triggered this. It was a classic case of play stupid games, win stupid prizes. On the forums, they cursed the developers, yet their passion for the game remained. Among them, Chun Wen-shan, the infamous racer of Mount Xiaoming, was already analyzing how to defeat him, suggesting they evolve a potent neurotoxin. His plan was to jump into the giant's lunchbox and be eaten, hoping to at least give the massive entity a severe case of diarrhea. One player even suggested evolving into a poisonous creature that looked like dung, poison hidden in filth. He was utterly speechless. This fellow had tried to disrespect him before, and now he was planning to hide poison in his food. To be honest, it was a bit much. He silently made a mental note of the man's name, wishing him luck for the future. With the sandbox forced offline, he picked up a white rubber hose and walked out to the sandbox. Using a hoe, he buried a 10-meter-long pipe underground between the 2 sandboxes, connecting the worlds. This was his new, exclusive VIP passage. Without his explicit permission, no one else could enter. After that, he returned to his room and put on his own VR headset. He registered a player account, keeping his little notebook of offenders nearby, and logged into the game. At first, there was only darkness. After a short while, the species he had been evolving finally crawled onto the shore. He looked down at his new body. He saw that he possessed a form just as strange as the other players. He was now a black-speared, 3-eyed crow. Between his 2 normal eyes sat a vertical pupil, covered in black feathers. He found that, for now, he couldn't even fly. For now, he could only glide a few meters above the ground. He couldn't help but notice this crow was just as hideous as the big-eyed monster. According to the law that the uglier a creature is, the stronger it becomes, he hoped its potential would be just as formidable. However, the world's core brain immediately dealt him a blow, stating it likely lacked extraordinary potential and was simply a failed evolution. On second thought, that made sense. Every evolution is unique, and the big-eyed monster was a miracle of coincidence that was hard to replicate. Still, his requirements were low. As long as he could move, it was enough. He entered the secret pipe and traveled through a long, dark tunnel. Light gradually appeared before his eyes, and we see him emerge into a dense, lush forest where the trees grew thick and tall. The earth felt soft, and in the distance, terrifying behemoths roared and gave chase. He had finally entered his own sandbox world. Waddling on his 2 crow claws with a rather arrogant stride, he headed straight toward the Babylon tribe, a place of growing significance. The houses here were well arranged, showing a degree of prosperity. Though the 3 witches were weaker than Gilgamesh, they held their own. They could barely resist the giant beasts now. In this massive food chain, humans sat in the middle, unable to fight the true apex predators. But they were no longer mere snacks. Having stabilized, they were breeding rapidly, knowing they needed a large population to produce more witches. Deep in the Emerald Mountains outside the tribe, by a pool that looked like a dreamlike wonderland, we find 3 beautiful women. They were currently bathing. More than 10 years had passed since their journey began, and much had changed in the tribe. In an era where most people died of old age in their 30s or 40s, almost all of their peers had already passed away. Yet time seemed to have forgotten them entirely. They remained youthful and physically fit, as if the years simply didn't apply. They looked like teenage girls. After all, when Gilgamesh fused with the 2nd generation of genes, he had lived for over 200 years. Since these 3 were only in their 30s now, their long lives were really just beginning. To be honest, they had plenty of time. Yuge soaked in the crystal-clear spring water and remarked lazily that another one of their people had passed away the previous night. The sisters they had grown up with were already gray-haired or gone. As the long years drifted by, a certain loneliness set in. They realized that in this changing world, only the bond between the 3 of them was truly eternal. Everything around them was changing, yet they remained untouched by time. It was a strange, lonely existence. The 2 elder sisters stood high above as the guardian goddesses of Babylon, yet they were entirely alone. Yuge asked if they ever envied ordinary girls who had husbands and children, glancing toward the youngest, Circe. Muge told her to show some respect, remembering how they had watched Circe spiral into darkness years ago. Back then, they swore an oath and established 3 laws. First, a witch must be pure before receiving the blood eye. Second, they were forbidden from ever loving anyone, and must avoid all contact with men after becoming a witch. Third, they must never use their power against humans, and Circe, naturally, was the perfect example of what not to do. Her mental power was so immense that if she failed to control her leaking emotions, she would accidentally kill weaker men. For over a decade, men in the tribe had been dying mysteriously every month, even as 4 new witches emerged. Fearing the growing instability, Muge and Xuangyin finally decided it was time to step in and suppress Cersei. But after their confrontation, they were horrified to discover that Cersei had secretly become far stronger than both of them. It took their combined strength just to hold her back. It seemed that while they suppressed themselves, Cersei thrived on indulgence. By the 16th year of Babylon, her unrestrained spirit had allowed her power to grow to terrifying heights. Cersei was now unfathomable, and the two sisters could barely resist her. She mocked them, asking why they didn't just give in. She argued that indulgence was better than repression, but the sisters insisted her path was a dangerous deviation. They were determined to find the correct way to train a witch's spirit. Seeing she couldn't convince them, Cersei's expression shifted. Her face gradually turned cold and predatory. If words wouldn't work, she would simply have to use force. An icy mental aura began to radiate from her body, causing the surrounding water to ripple and pull away in waves. Muge and Xuangyin paled, shocked that she had reached such a level. They realized they had to strike immediately. Suddenly, 4 new witches appeared by the pool holding black staves. It seemed Muge had come prepared for this betrayal. They intended to combine the strength of every witch to defeat Cersei, but she only scoffed at their collective effort. With a sudden, violent surge of her mental power, Cersei struck out, sending massive plumes of water erupting into the air. As the shockwaves settled, a strangely gentle voice suddenly drifted through the air, commenting on the impressive power of the witches. We see a creature unlike any they had ever encountered, a 3-eyed crow with feathers as black as the void. It sat quietly upon a lush branch, watching their every move. Naturally, the witches demanded to know who, or what, it was. Their hearts raced in shock. After all, their mental field should have made it impossible for any male presence to approach undetected. Deciding to deal with the intruder first, all the witches, Cersei included, unleashed a massive, unified mental strike at the bird. Even the most terrifying beast would have perished instantly, yet the blow struck the black crow without leaving a single mark. It was impossible. The witches stared at the crow in stunned silence, their minds reeling at such an inexplicable outcome. A single thought echoed through all of them. What kind of power was this? The crow simply replied that it was the power of meditation. The witches continued to gaze at the bird in disbelief, trembling as they asked once more for its identity. As they stared, the same question burned in their minds. What force could possibly withstand their combined might? The crow spoke from its perch, explaining that while they relied on mental energy, its own protection came from the Creator. Their attacks couldn't harm it, though it claimed, quite modestly, to be nothing more than an ordinary, bird-like creature. The elder witches were witnessing something unprecedented, a non-human being possessed of speech and profound wisdom. They recalled ancient myths of intelligent life beyond humanity, beings they could only describe as gods. The crow told them that if they wished to call it a god, they could, for it was indeed a creation of the Lord of all. It explained that while it possessed great power, it was unique and lacked the ability to reproduce, unlike the humans before it. It introduced itself as Xuanma, the god of wisdom appointed to oversee all living things, though it had other names as well. It had come to ignite the flame of knowledge for the primitive Babylon tribe and bring them the ultimate truth of the world. Truth is the collection of all the world's rules and the source of all power. Everything you see is contained within it. He declared his intent to grant mortals the triple truth, knowledge that would forever govern the arts of alchemy and witchcraft. The expressions of the crowd shifted completely. Long ago, the ancestors received 3 treasures of civilization, and now they were to receive more. They were about to inherit the triple knowledge of truth. To be honest, encountering such a legendary miracle felt like a dream. The first path was the cultivation of the spirit, providing the foundation to ascend toward the level of great beings like Xuanma. The second was alchemy, the mysterious study of creating life and the unknown. It was the tool to pry open the gates of truth, based on the principle that all things in the world interact and can be exchanged. This was the core principle and the great mystery of alchemy, that all things are interconnected, opposing and replacing one another. All the secrets of alchemy were hidden within a single formula, where one essence delights in another. One essence overcomes another, and one essence dominates another. It was a complex cycle of universal power. The witches listened with half understanding, looking both enchanted and incredibly nervous. They were terrified of missing a single word. Third, he explained that witchcraft was a power allowing the spirit to separate earth from fire, or to extract flame from the ocean. Following this principle, extraordinary transformations would arise from a single source. Suddenly, the 3-eyed crow fell from its branch and hit the ground. Having finished the speech, our protagonist's consciousness left the bird. He departed from the sandbox world and logged off, finally removing his VR headset and returning to reality. He sighed with relief, having memorized the script multiple times for fear of a mistake. Acting, clearly, was not his forte. If it weren't for the sake of curing his illness, he never would have bothered memorizing such elaborate lines. Trying to guide a civilization as a creator without revealing he was actually quite weak was a constant struggle. To be perfectly honest, if figures like the ancient ancestors appeared before him in real life, they could crush him with one hand. Even the power held by the three witches had been forged through countless trials of death and suffering. They were extraordinary beings far beyond his reach, yet he had to deceive them. Just thinking about it gave him a headache. Deep down, he was just an ordinary man. After logging off, he took a shower and restarted the sandbox game within minutes. The players all logged back on immediately, cursing and playing like madmen as they struggled to evolve new species. Using a new world-scale sandbox to simulate civilization just to cure a terminal illness was, to be honest, a bit extreme. No one else in the world would likely attempt such a thing, but the path was difficult and the seeds had been planted. Of the three paths, the one he anticipated most was the Tree of Alchemy. Yes, that was his true focus. He hoped to create potions and medicines to cure his cancer, though alchemy trees usually only existed in myths. Realizing it would be difficult, he figured meditation and witchcraft might work instead, much like yogic meditation. Eastern Qigong had similar practices for cultivating the spirit, which was a certainty. As for witchcraft, he knew that once spiritual power increased, various ingenious applications would naturally develop. The preparations were finally complete. Now, it all depended on how they evolved. It was a pity there were still so few transcendent species like the Blood-Eye. If there were more, they would provide better inspiration. He sighed while watching the players, wishing they would focus more. Instead of evolving high potential species, these guys spent their days looking for shortcuts and trying to mess with him. They were a bunch of animals, and he realized he needed to find a way to squeeze every bit of utility out of them. Just then, Su Qin's voice came from the door, reminding Ling Chun it was time to head to the class reunion. He figured a trip to the city might clear his head, so he changed into new clothes and stepped out. To the players, the giant had returned. They screamed for everyone to run from the colossal giant, one even joking that with 6 legs, he only had to outrun the others. On the ground, the swarm of ant-like players scattered in a frenzy. He had no intention of stepping on them, of course. He was simply wondering how to fully exploit this free, intelligent labor. Once outside, he found Su Qin waiting on her electric scooter, and soon they arrived at a mid-range restaurant's large private room. As the door opened, we see a room full of energetic young men and women gathered around tables, eating and chatting. The moment he stepped inside, the room erupted in confusion, with people wondering if he had the wrong room, until Su Qin stepped out from behind him. Clearly satisfied with the explosive reaction she had caused, she introduced him as her boyfriend, Ling Chun, claiming he was incredibly handsome. She was certainly putting on a show. Several girls crowded around to inspect him while he sat there quietly, letting it happen. He knew he was only there to help her show off. Though he had reverted to his old face, 3 mass extinctions had stripped away his useless genes. His form was now approaching perfection, and that superhuman aura was impossible to hide. Naturally, a few jealous boys approached to challenge him with drinks. He didn't refuse a single glass. Having worked in the real world for years, he found these simple schoolboys quite easy to handle. They didn't harbor any real malice, but with his current physique, getting drunk was nearly impossible. After he downed 3 or 4 of them, no one else dared to challenge him. After dinner, they went to sing karaoke, where he sat on the sofa quietly checking his phone. He planned to wait until Su Qin was tired before taking her home, but a casual glance at the boys nearby revealed they were watching a live stream. It was a broadcast of the Bowsy evolution. They marveled at the infinite possibilities, assuming a supercomputer was simulating the world in real time. One boy complained that the current player was too stupid and that he could do better, wishing for an open beta. Another argued it was impossible, citing experts who claimed the computational load for such a realistic virtual world was too massive for a wide release. They believed the number of players was limited by hardware, but they were, of course, quite mistaken about the nature of this reality. Since this wasn't a virtual world but a real one, it didn't need servers. The only thing limiting the player count was his own will. The boys lamented how hardcore the game was and how poorly the current 100 players were performing with their strange, inefficient species. A student majoring in natural evolution watched with envy, certain that a professional like himself could evolve a truly specialized species. The idea of letting the professionals do it struck him like a bolt of lightning. Suddenly, he knew exactly what his next move should be. It seemed this little trip to help Su Qin relax had been well worth the time after all. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted as voices shouted for everyone to freeze and not to move, except for one person who was ordered to keep moving. The shouting continued as they ordered everyone to stay still, while forcing one person to keep moving forward. They pushed him along, barked out numbers and orders, and kept the pressure on without a moment's rest. The commands became a rhythmic chant of movement, forcing the pace as the tension in the room spiked. They were relentless, driving him further and further as the situation spiraled into chaos. Every step was dictated by those sharp commands, leaving no room for hesitation or second thoughts. And so, the steady rhythm of the march continued, pulling everyone deeper into this sudden, unexpected confrontation.